Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're stepping behind the velvet rope of American history into the private world of a man whose face you've seen 1,000 times, but whose real story might surprise you. John F. Kennedy. The dazzling smile, the perfect hair, the picture-perfect family. But here's the thing. That image was carefully constructed, and the truth underneath was far more human, far more fragile, and honestly, far more fascinating. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. What time is it where you are? I always love knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now settle in, dim those lights, and let's peel back the layers on one of America's most mythologized presidents. Because behind that iconic charm was a man popping a dozen different pills just to get through the day, a husband whose marriage was anything but simple, and a father who knew heartbreak most of us can't imagine. Ready to meet the real JFK? Let's go. So let's rewind the clock. Before the presidency, before the glamour, before Jackie and the White House dinners and the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was just a skinny, sickly kid from Massachusetts trying desperately to keep up with his older brother, and failing, repeatedly, in ways that would shape everything about who John Fitzgerald Kennedy would become. The Kennedy family wasn't just large, it was practically its own small nation. 9 children in total born to Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy between 1915 and 1932. That's 17 years of continuous baby-making, which honestly sounds exhausting just to type. Joseph Jr. came first in 1915, then John in 1917, followed by Rosemary in 1918, Kathleen in 1920, Eunice in 1921, Patricia in 1924, Robert in 1925, Jean in 1928, and finally Edward, Ted, in 1932. If you're keeping count, that's 4 boys and 5 girls, all raised under one very competitive roof in Brookline, Massachusetts, before the family eventually moved to New York. Now plenty of families had lots of kids in those days. What made the Kennedy household different was the atmosphere of relentless, almost obsessive competition that Joseph Sr. deliberately cultivated. This wasn't a household where participation trophies existed. This was a household where second place was just first loser, and losing was simply not acceptable. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had clawed his way up from the grandson of Irish immigrants to become one of the wealthiest men in America through a combination of stock market speculation, real estate dealings, and, if the rumors were true, some rather creative business ventures during Prohibition. He had opinions about success, and he wasn't shy about sharing them with his children. Frequently, loudly, and with the expectation of immediate results. The dinner table at the Kennedy home wasn't a place for casual conversation about how everyone's day went. It was more like a nightly quiz show meets debate tournament meets athletic recruitment meeting. Joseph Sr. would pepper his children with questions about current events, politics, history, and economics. He expected informed answers. He expected strong opinions backed by facts. And he expected his children to argue their positions vigorously. If you didn't know what was happening in the world, you'd better figure it out before dinner, because showing up unprepared was its own form of failure. Rose Kennedy, for her part, actually posted newspaper clippings on a bulletin board so her children could study up before meals. Not exactly the relaxed family dinners you might remember from your own childhood, unless your childhood involved mandatory current events briefings, in which case I have questions. But the competition didn't stop at intellectual sparring. Oh no, the Kennedy children were expected to excel physically as well. Touch football games on the lawn weren't friendly afternoon activities. They were full-contact events where winning mattered and injuries were just part of the game. Swimming races, sailing competitions, tennis matches, everything became a contest. Joseph Sr. believed that competition built character, that it prepared his children for the cutthroat world of business and politics he envisioned them conquering. Whether the children agreed with this philosophy was largely irrelevant. They were Kennedys, and Kennedys competed. Kennedys won. Or at least they were supposed to. This is where young John's problems began. Because while Joseph Jr., the golden child, the firstborn son, the one their father had already mentally fitted for the presidency, was naturally athletic, robust, and seemingly designed for competition, John was kind of a mess. Not in terms of intelligence or charm. Even as a child, he had a quick wit and an easy smile that drew people to him. But physically, the kid just could not catch a break. It started early, really early. When John was just 2 years old in 1919, he contracted scarlet fever. Now, scarlet fever today is mostly just an annoyance that requires some antibiotics and rest. But in 1919, This was serious business. There were no antibiotics yet. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered until 1928 and wouldn't be widely available until the 1940s. Scarlet fever killed children. It killed a lot of children. And for a terrifying period, it looked like it might kill little John Kennedy too. He was sick enough that his father, Joseph Sr., not generally known as a particularly devout man, actually went to church and prayed, reportedly promising to donate half his fortune to charity if his son survived. John did survive, though whether Joseph actually followed through on that promise to the full extent is historically debatable. What matters is that this near-death experience at age 2 was just the opening act in what would become a lifetime of medical drama. After scarlet fever, the health problems just kept coming. Whooping cough followed. Then chickenpox. Then measles. If there was a childhood illness making the rounds in Massachusetts, young John seemed determined to collect them all like some kind of disease-based trading card game. While his older brother Joe was out playing sports and generally being annoyingly healthy, John spent large portions of his childhood in bed, reading books and staring at the ceiling and probably wondering what he'd done to deserve this. The family moved from Brookline to New York when John was 10, settling in Riverdale in the Bronx before later relocating to Bronxville. The change of scenery did not, unfortunately, come with a change in John's health. If anything, things got worse as he got older. He developed persistent stomach problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. He had mysterious bouts of weakness and fatigue that doctors couldn't explain. He seemed to catch every cold, every flu, every passing infection that floated through whatever school he was attending at the time. And there were many schools. John's education was a patchwork of different institutions, partly because his family moved, partly because of his health issues, and partly because, let's be honest here, he wasn't exactly a model student. Not because he wasn't smart. He was clearly intelligent, with a particular gift for history and writing. But he was also restless, mischievous, and not particularly interested in following rules he considered pointless. His report cards consistently noted that he was capable of much better work than he was producing. Teachers liked him personally. Almost everyone liked Jack, as he was called by friends and family, but they were frustrated by his tendency to coast on charm rather than apply himself. He attended Riverdale Country School in New York, then Canterbury School in Connecticut, a Catholic boarding school where he lasted all of 1 year before illness forced him to leave. Then it was off to Choate, an elite preparatory school in Wallingford, Connecticut, where his older brother Joe was already established as a star student and athlete. Because of course he was. Choate was where the competition between the two brothers became impossible to ignore. Joe Jr. was everything their father wanted in a son: athletic, academically successful, popular, and driven. He was the golden boy, the heir apparent, the one everyone assumed would go into politics and maybe, if the stars aligned and their father's ambitions were realized, become the first Catholic president of the United States. Joe Sr. made no secret of his plans for his eldest son. He talked about it openly, mapped out Joe Jr.'s future like a military campaign, and invested enormous energy into preparing him for greatness. And then there was Jack. Skinny, sickly Jack, who couldn't seem to stay healthy for more than a few weeks at a time. Jack, who was smart but unfocused, charming but undisciplined. Jack, who was perpetually living in his brother's shadow and seemed, at least outwardly, not to mind too much. He joked about it, actually. Self-deprecation became his defense mechanism early on, a way of acknowledging his second-place status while maintaining his dignity. If he couldn't beat Joe at being the perfect Kennedy son, he could at least be the funny one, the irreverent one, the one who didn't take himself too seriously. At Choate, Jack became known as much for his pranks and social adventures as for his academic work. He and a group of friends, they called themselves the Muckers, after the headmaster used that term to criticize students he considered troublemakers, made it their mission to have as much unsanctioned fun as possible within the strict confines of boarding school life. They broke curfews. They pulled pranks. They generally made themselves a nuisance to the administration, while somehow remaining charming enough to avoid the most severe consequences. The headmaster actually called Joseph Sr. at one point, concerned that his son was heading down the wrong path. Jack was nearly expelled. He graduated, but his record was far from distinguished. Meanwhile, Joe Jr. was at Harvard, continuing his ascent toward the destiny their father had planned for him. He was president of his freshman class. He was on the football team. He was, by all accounts, exactly the young man Joseph Sr. had designed him to be. But here's the thing about being the second son, the one who's always a step behind, the one who's never quite healthy enough or focused enough or serious enough to meet expectations. Sometimes it gives you a different perspective. Jack Kennedy, lying in bed with yet another mysterious illness, reading history books and biographies and anything else he could get his hands on, was developing something his father couldn't have planned for and his brother couldn't compete with. He was developing an inner life, a thoughtfulness, a complexity that came from having time to think and nothing to do but read and reflect. The sickly child was becoming, almost by accident, an intellectual, not in the showy, aggressive way his father demanded at dinner table debates, but in a quieter, more personal way. He was genuinely curious about the world, about history, about why people did what they did and how events unfolded the way they did. His enforced bed rest, frustrating as it must have been for a young man who wanted to be out playing sports with his siblings, gave him something valuable, time to develop the kind of deep, reflective intelligence that would later make him such a compelling political figure. Of course, he didn't know any of that at the time. At the time, he was just a teenager who wanted to feel healthy and couldn't understand why his body kept betraying him. The specific causes of many of his ailments wouldn't be properly diagnosed for years. Medicine in the 1930s was still relatively primitive by modern standards. Doctors were often guessing, prescribing rest and various remedies without really understanding the underlying conditions they were dealing with. After Choate, Jack followed his brother to Harvard, entering in 1936. He was 18 years old, still thin, still prone to illness, still living in Joe Jr.'s considerable shadow. But something started to shift during his college years. Maybe it was getting a little distance from the intensity of the Kennedy household. Maybe it was finding subjects that genuinely interested him, particularly international relations and political science. Maybe he was just growing up. Whatever the reason, Jack began to apply himself in ways he hadn't before. He still had health problems. Of course he did. During his freshman year, he was hospitalized multiple times for various ailments. His back, which had been bothering him since his teenage years, was getting progressively worse. He tried out for the football team because he was a Kennedy and Kennedys competed, and made the junior varsity squad, but a back injury ended that attempt at athletic glory pretty quickly. Swimming became his sport of choice instead, easier on his spine than the violent collisions of football. But academically, something was clicking. He became interested in politics and history in a serious way, particularly fascinated by European affairs as the continent lurched toward war. In 1938, his father was appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom by President Franklin Roosevelt, a posting that gave the Kennedy family a front-row seat to the gathering storm of World War II. Jack visited his father in London and travelled extensively through Europe, witnessing firsthand the tensions and anxieties of a continent on the brink of catastrophe. This experience would shape his senior thesis at Harvard, an analysis of why Britain had been so slow to prepare for war with Nazi Germany. He titled it Appeasement at Munich, and it was actually good. Really good. Good enough that, with some editing help and his father's connections, it was published as a book called Why England Slept in 1940. The book was a bestseller. Jack Kennedy, the sickly second son, the underachiever, the mucker, had accomplished something his golden brother hadn't. He'd written a successful book before he was even 25 years old. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that childhood, to those early years of illness and competition, because they matter more than you might think. The patterns established in the Kennedy household in Brookline and Bronxville, the relentless drive to succeed, the fierce sibling rivalry, the expectation of excellence in all things, would shape John Kennedy for the rest of his life. Even when that life was cut short by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, he was still, in some fundamental way, that skinny kid trying to keep up with his big brother, trying to prove he belonged at the table with the rest of the Kennedys. The family dynamics were complicated in ways that went beyond simple competition. Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, was devoutly Catholic and somewhat emotionally distant. She showed her love through organization and discipline rather than warmth and affection. She kept detailed index cards on each of her children, tracking their health, their achievements, their various activities. It was efficient. It was thorough. It was not exactly cozy. The children respected their mother, certainly, but the emotional intensity of the family flowed through Joseph Sr., whose approval they all craved and whose criticism they all feared. Joseph Sr. played favourites, and he wasn't subtle about it. Joe Jr. was the chosen one, the repository of all his political ambitions. The girls were expected to make good marriages and support their brothers' careers. The younger boys, Bobby and Ted, were still children when Jack was at Harvard, not yet players in the family drama. That left Jack in an awkward middle position, important enough to have expectations placed on him, but not important enough to be the focus of his father's grand plans. He was the spare, the backup, the one who would support Joe Jr.'s rise to power from whatever secondary position he could manage. This second son status had psychological effects that are hard to overstate. On one hand, it freed Jack from the crushing weight of being the anointed one. Joe Jr. had to be perfect, had to succeed, had to fulfill his father's dreams. Jack just had to not embarrass the family. The bar was lower, which paradoxically gave him more room to develop his own personality, his own interests, his own way of being in the world. He could be witty and irreverent because he wasn't carrying the burden of being the future president. On the other hand, growing up knowing you're the second choice, the consolation prize, the one your father tolerates rather than celebrates, that leaves marks. Jack Kennedy would spend his entire life proving himself, pushing past physical limitations that would have stopped most people, achieving things that nobody expected from the sickly second son. Even after he became president, the office his father had dreamed of for Joe Jr., who died in World War II before he could claim it, Jack was still, in some sense, trying to prove he deserved to be there, trying to live up to a brother whose potential would forever remain unrealized and therefore idealized. The physical competition among the Kennedy siblings was legendary. Those touch football games weren't just intense, they were practically combat operations. Broken bones were common. Bloody noses were expected. The Kennedy children and their friends played to win, and they played hard. Visiting friends and future spouses would be roped into these games and often emerged traumatized, wondering what kind of family they'd gotten themselves involved with. The Kennedys found this amusing. They were building character. They were preparing for life's battles. They were also, not to put too fine a point on it, creating an environment where vulnerability was weakness and showing pain was unacceptable. For Jack, who was genuinely fragile, this culture of aggressive physicality must have been torturous. He participated anyway. What choice did he have? Sitting out would have been an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that he couldn't keep up, that he wasn't really a Kennedy in the way his siblings were. So he played through the pain, pushed through the exhaustion, competed even when his body was screaming at him to stop. This pattern, ignoring physical limitations, refusing to let illness sideline him, maintaining a facade of vigor even when he was suffering, would define his entire adult life. The Kennedy children were also raised with a sense of noblesse oblige, an expectation that their privilege came with responsibilities. They were wealthy, yes. They had advantages most Americans could only dream of. But they were expected to give back, to serve, to use their resources and abilities for something larger than personal gain. This wasn't just philosophical musing, it was explicitly taught, reinforced, demanded. Kennedys didn't just accumulate wealth and power for its own sake. Kennedys made a difference. Kennedys led. Kennedys served. This sense of public duty would obviously become central to Jack's political career, but its roots were planted in childhood, in those dinner table discussions and those constant reminders that the Kennedy children were special, that they were destined for greatness, that they had obligations beyond themselves. It was a heavy burden to place on young shoulders, but it was also, in its own way, a gift. Growing up believing you're meant to do something important creates a certain kind of confidence, a certain kind of purpose that many people spend their whole lives searching for. But let's get back to the sickness, because that's really the thread that runs through Jack's entire early life. After scarlet fever at age 2, he seemed to develop what doctors vaguely called stomach problems that manifested as persistent nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. He was thin, partly because eating was often uncomfortable. He was weak, partly because his body never seemed to properly absorb nutrients. Doctors examined him, tested him, theorized about what might be wrong, but definitive answers remained elusive. At 14, he developed such severe intestinal issues that he was sent to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota for evaluation. The Mayo Clinic was then, as now, one of the premier medical institutions in the country. If anyone could figure out what was wrong with young Jack Kennedy, it would be them. The doctors there ran tests, consulted with each other, and ultimately diagnosed him with colitis, an inflammation of the colon. They prescribed a careful diet and rest. It helped somewhat, but it didn't cure him. Nothing ever really cured him. The back problems began around the same time, though their origins were murky. Some accounts suggest he injured his back playing football at Choate. Others point to a swimming incident. Still others suggest the back issues were related to his overall physical fragility, possibly connected to the same underlying condition that was causing his stomach problems and his susceptibility to infection. Whatever the cause, by his late teens, Jack Kennedy was dealing with chronic back pain that would only get worse over time. He tried to hide it, of course. Kennedys didn't complain about pain. Kennedys pushed through. But friends and family who knew him well could see the signs. The careful way he sat down, the stiffness when he stood up, the occasional grimace he couldn't quite suppress. His back was a constant companion, a source of suffering he carried with him everywhere while maintaining to the outside world an image of youthful vigour. This gap between image and reality would become one of the defining features of John Kennedy's life. He learned early, in that competitive household with its impossible standards, that appearing strong was almost as important as being strong. Maybe more important. The world judged you on what they could see, and what they could see was a smiling, charming young man from a wealthy family who seemed to have everything going for him. What they couldn't see, the pills he took, the treatments he endured, the pain he managed, was private, hidden, protected. This was a lesson he absorbed so thoroughly that by the time he became president, the gap between his public image and his private reality had grown into a chasm. The other children in the Kennedy family had their own struggles, of course. Rosemary, the eldest daughter, had developmental disabilities that the family went to great lengths to hide, a shameful secret in an era that stigmatized such conditions. She would eventually be lobotomized in 1941, on Joseph Sr.'s orders, a procedure that left her incapacitated for the rest of her life. The family didn't talk about it. They told people Rosemary was teaching school or traveling, anything but the truth. The Kennedy image had to be maintained at all costs. Kathleen, Kick, was vivacious and popular, perhaps the most naturally charismatic of all the Kennedy children. She would die in a plane crash in 1948, just 4 years after her beloved brother Joe Jr. died in his own aviation disaster during World War II. Bobby and Ted would both face tragedy in their adult lives. Bobby assassinated in 1968, and Ted forever marked by the Chappaquiddick incident in 1969. The Kennedy family, for all its wealth and privilege, was stalked by death and disaster in ways that seemed almost biblical. But in those early years, before the war, before the assassinations, before the full weight of the Kennedy curse had revealed itself, there was just a big family in a big house, competing fiercely for their father's approval and trying to live up to impossible expectations. And there was Jack, the second son, the sick one, the one who read books in bed while his siblings played outside, quietly developing the qualities that would eventually take him further than any of them. Except, of course, for the brother whose death would give Jack the opportunity he never expected to have. The relationship between Jack and Joe Jr. deserves more attention because it shaped Jack in profound ways. They were only 2 years apart, close enough in age to be natural rivals, but far enough apart that Joe always had the advantage. Joe was bigger, stronger, healthier, more athletic. He was also, by most accounts, more aggressive, more domineering, more likely to use his physical advantage to put his younger brother in his place. The brothers fought, as brothers do. They competed in everything, and Jack almost always lost. But Jack also admired his brother. How could he not? Joe Jr. was everything Jack wanted to be. Healthy, vigorous, seemingly destined for greatness. The hero worship was mixed with resentment, of course. How could it not be? But it was real. Jack looked up to Joe, wanted his approval, measured himself against his older brother's accomplishments and usually came up short. When Joe got into Harvard, Jack had to get into Harvard. When Joe made the football team, Jack had to try out for the football team. The pattern was set early and never really broke. Their father encouraged this competition, believing it would make both boys stronger. He wasn't entirely wrong. The rivalry did push Jack to accomplish things he might not have attempted otherwise. But it also created a dynamic where Jack's achievements were always measured against his brother's, always slightly less impressive, always in Joe's shadow. Even Jack's book, Why England Slept, was seen partly as an attempt to match or exceed his brother's accomplishments. He was still competing, still trying to prove himself, still the second son looking for his own path to glory. The irony, of course, is that Joe Jr.'s death in 1944 would remove the competitor and leave Jack as the standard-bearer for his father's ambitions. But that transformation was years away, unimaginable to the Kennedy family in the 1930s. Back then, the future seemed clear. Joe would enter politics, Joe would rise through the ranks, Joe would become senator and then maybe, just maybe, president. Jack would do something else. Support his brother, probably. Make his own way in business or law or academia, staying close to the family while letting Joe take the spotlight. It's worth pausing here to consider what it meant to be Irish Catholic in America during Jack's childhood. The Kennedys were wealthy, yes, but they were still outsiders in many ways. The old Protestant establishment that ran America The Wasps, as they would later be called, didn't fully accept Irish Catholics, no matter how much money they had. Joseph Sr. faced this prejudice throughout his career, excluded from the social clubs and corporate boards that welcomed men of similar wealth but different heritage. He was determined that his children would break through these barriers, would force America to accept them, would prove that being Irish Catholic was no obstacle to reaching the very top of American society. This chip-on-the-shoulder mentality permeated the Kennedy household. They weren't just competing with each other. They were competing against an establishment that didn't want them, proving themselves to a society that looked down on them. It added another layer to the relentless drive for achievement, another motivation for excellence. Every Kennedy success was a victory not just for the individual but for the family, for Irish Catholics everywhere, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Jack absorbed this message along with everything else. He grew up, success meant vindicating his people. Failure meant confirming the prejudices of those who thought Irish Catholics weren't good enough. It was another weight to carry, another pressure to perform, another reason why showing weakness, physical or otherwise, was simply not an option. As we follow Jack Kennedy through his teenage years and into young adulthood, we see someone being formed by forces he couldn't control. His family's expectations, his father's ambitions, his brother's shadow, his body's constant betrayal. He was learning to cope, to compensate, to present a confident face to the world while managing private struggles no one could see. He was developing the charm, the wit, the easy grace that would make him so attractive to voters decades later. He was also developing the habit of secrecy, of maintaining a careful separation between his public persona and his private reality. The sickly child was becoming the man who would become president. But that journey was just beginning, and there were many more trials ahead, physical, emotional, political, before Jack Kennedy would stand in the cold January air of 1961 and take the oath of office. The patterns established in childhood, in that competitive household with its impossibly high standards, would shape everything that followed. The drive to succeed despite obstacles. The refusal to let physical limitations define him. The carefully maintained image of vigor and health. The gap between what the world saw and what was actually true. All of it started here, in a big family with big ambitions, where a skinny, sickly second son was learning that in the Kennedy world, weakness was not an option, and the only acceptable response to being knocked down was to get back up and keep fighting. He didn't know yet that he would one day lead the nation through the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, negotiate with Khrushchev over missiles in Cuba, inspire a generation with his vision of public service. He was just a kid trying to keep up with his big brother, trying to earn his father's approval, trying to figure out why his body kept failing him. But even then, even in those difficult early years, there were hints of what was to come. The intelligence that made him such a compelling writer. The charm that drew people to him despite his physical limitations. The resilience that kept him going when others might have given up. The ability to find humour and lightness even in difficult circumstances, a quality that would serve him well in the pressure cooker of the presidency. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was being forged in these years, shaped by competition and illness and family dynamics that were equal parts inspiring and suffocating. The man who emerged from this crucible would change history. But he would carry the marks of his formation forever, the drive, the secrecy, the determination to appear strong no matter what, the constant management of pain that the public never knew about. The sickly child became the vigorous president. The second son became the leader of the free world. The boy who could never quite keep up with his brother became the man whose name would echo through history long after Joe Jr.'s had faded into footnote status. It's quite a transformation. But it didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen easily. It happened through years of struggle, years of illness, years of being underestimated and overlooked and written off as the lesser Kennedy. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what made him capable of becoming something extraordinary. Not despite his limitations, but in some strange way because of them. The challenges he faced forced him to develop qualities, intellectual depth, emotional resilience, the ability to connect with others who struggled, that his healthier, more privileged brother might never have needed to cultivate. The second son, the sick one, the one nobody expected much from, would end up exceeding everyone's expectations, including perhaps his own. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, let's just remember where it started. A big Irish Catholic family in Massachusetts, a competitive father with enormous ambitions, a golden older brother casting a long shadow, and a skinny kid with too many illnesses and not enough strength, lying in bed and reading books and dreaming of what? We don't really know what young Jack Kennedy dreamed about. Maybe he dreamed of being healthy. Maybe he dreamed of beating his brother at something, anything. Maybe he dreamed of proving everyone wrong. Whatever he dreamed, he would eventually achieve things that exceeded any reasonable expectation. But he would pay for those achievements with a lifetime of hidden suffering, secret medications, and carefully managed pain. The seeds of all of it, the triumph and the tragedy, the glory and the secrets, were planted here in childhood, in a household where excellence was demanded and weakness was forbidden, where a sick boy learned to hide his pain and keep fighting no matter what. That's the foundation of the Kennedy story. That's where it all began. And understanding that foundation is essential to understanding everything that came after. The politics, the presidency, the private life we're here to explore tonight. Because John F. Kennedy never really stopped being that sickly second son, no matter how high he rose. He just got better at hiding it, at projecting strength he didn't always feel, at convincing the world he was something he secretly feared he wasn't. The gap between image and reality. The public face and the private truth. It started here, in a competitive family where a boy with a broken body learned to smile through the pain and keep up appearances no matter what. And it would define him, for better and worse, until the very end. But let's dig a little deeper into those childhood years, because there's more texture here than we've explored. The Kennedy homes, first in Brookline, then in Riverdale and Bronxville, were not just houses. They were training grounds carefully designed by Joseph and Rose Kennedy to produce exceptional children. The organizational system Rose implemented would make a modern project manager weep with admiration. She kept those index cards on each child, yes, but she also maintained detailed schedules, assigned specific responsibilities, and created systems for everything from laundry rotation to religious instruction. The children attended Mass regularly. Rose Kennedy was devout in a way that Joseph Sr. was not. He attended church when it was politically convenient, but his real religion was success, power, and the advancement of his family. Rose, however, genuinely believed, and she instilled that faith in her children. Jack would remain Catholic throughout his life, though his relationship with the church was complicated, and his faith was probably more cultural than deeply spiritual. Still, the rhythm of Catholic life, the rituals, the holidays, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself, shaped his worldview in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The Kennedy household also had a strict hierarchy. The older children were expected to look after the younger ones. Joe Jr., as the eldest son, occupied a position of authority just below the parents themselves. He could discipline his younger siblings, assign them tasks, and generally lord over them in ways that would probably prompt intervention from child psychologists today. Jack, as the second eldest, had his own subordinates, the younger girls and eventually Bobby and Ted. But he also had Joe above him, always setting a standard he was expected to meet. This sibling hierarchy created complicated relationships. Jack and his sister Kathleen Kick were particularly close. She shared his sense of humour, his irreverence, his willingness to question the family orthodoxy while still remaining fundamentally loyal to it. They became confidants, allies in the sometimes suffocating world of Kennedy expectations. Kick understood Jack in ways that Joe Jr., too busy being perfect, never quite could. She saw his struggles, appreciated his wit, and didn't judge him for falling short of their father's impossible standards. The Kennedy children also had the advantage, or burden, depending on how you look at it, of considerable wealth. They didn't grow up wanting for material things. There were servants, nannies, cooks, and groundskeepers. There were summers at the family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, where the competitive games took on an almost ritualistic quality. There were winters in Palm Beach, Florida, where the weather was kinder to Jack's fragile constitution. The family traveled, entertained, lived large in the way that only the truly wealthy could during the Depression era, when most Americans were struggling just to get by. This wealth insulated the Kennedy children from ordinary hardships but created its own pressures. When you have every material advantage, there are no excuses for failure. When your family has money, connections, and opportunities that others can only dream of, you're expected to do something extraordinary with those resources. The Kennedy children couldn't blame their circumstances for any shortcomings. They had been given every tool for success, and they were expected to use them. For Jack, whose tools included a body that frequently failed him, this expectation must have been particularly frustrating. He had the intelligence, the education, the family connections. What he didn't have was reliable health, and no amount of money could buy that. His father spent considerable sums on doctors, treatments, and medical consultations, trying to fix whatever was wrong with his second son. But the body can't always be bought or bullied into cooperation. Jack's illnesses persisted despite the best medical care money could provide. The specific nature of those early illnesses is worth examining in more detail. After the scarlet fever at age 2, Jack seemed to develop a pattern of recurring infections and mysterious ailments that doctors struggled to explain. Some historians and medical researchers, looking back with modern knowledge, have suggested that he may have had an undiagnosed autoimmune condition that weakened his immune system and made him susceptible to infections. Others have pointed to the possibility of celiac disease or other digestive disorders that would explain his chronic stomach problems and his difficulty maintaining weight. Whatever the underlying cause, the symptoms were real and debilitating. Jack missed weeks and sometimes months of school due to illness. He spent extended periods in hospitals and clinics, undergoing tests and treatments that often produced more questions than answers. The letters and diaries from this period reveal a young man who was frustrated by his body's limitations, but determined not to let them define him. He joked about his illnesses, made light of his hospital stays, used humour as a shield against the fear and frustration that must have accompanied his medical struggles. His time at Canterbury School, the Catholic boarding school he attended briefly before transferring to Choate, offers a glimpse into how illness disrupted his life. He arrived at Canterbury in the fall of 1930, 13 years old and hopeful for a fresh start at a new school. Within weeks he was sick. Within months he was too ill to continue. He withdrew from Canterbury in the spring of 1931, having completed less than a full year of education there. The official reason was appendicitis, but the reality was more complicated. His health had simply been too poor to sustain the demands of boarding school life. At Choate, where he transferred after Canterbury, Jack developed strategies for managing his health while maintaining his social standing. He cultivated friendships with boys who would cover for him when he needed to rest, who would share notes from classes he missed, who would keep his secrets about how often he felt truly terrible. His roommate Lem Billings became one of his closest lifelong friends, a relationship that began at Choate and endured until Jack's death. Lem understood Jack's health struggles and accepted them without judgment, providing the kind of unconditional friendship that was rare in Jack's competitive world. The Muckers incident, which nearly got Jack expelled from Choate, reveals something important about his character. The headmaster, George Saint. John had given a speech criticising students who were muckers, troublemakers who undermined the school's mission and corrupted their fellow students. Jack and his friends, rather than being chastened by this criticism, embraced it. They formed a secret club called the Muckers, complete with membership cards and initiation rituals. When the headmaster discovered this deliberate mockery of his authority, he was furious. Jack's father was called in for a meeting. Expulsion was seriously considered. In the end, Jack survived. Partly because of his charm, partly because of his father's influence, and partly because even the frustrated headmaster had to admit that Jack Kennedy wasn't a bad kid, just an irreverent one. But the incident reveals Jack's willingness to push back against authority, his instinct to find humour in serious situations, and his tendency to lead his friends into trouble. These traits would serve him well in some contexts and poorly in others throughout his life. The summer breaks at Hyannisport provided a different kind of testing ground. The Kennedy compound there became legendary, a collection of houses where the extended family gathered for weeks of sailing, swimming, and those infamous touch football games. The competition at Hyannisport was even more intense than at home, if such a thing was possible. Cousins, friends, and eventually spouses were drawn into the Kennedy orbit and expected to participate in the constant contests. Those who couldn't keep up were pitied at best, dismissed at worst. For Jack, Hyannisport was both a refuge and a challenge. The ocean air seemed to help his health, and sailing became one of the few athletic activities where his physical limitations didn't hold him back. On a boat, strategy and skill mattered more than raw strength or stamina. Jack was a good sailor, eventually an excellent one, and this gave him an arena where he could compete with his brother on something approaching equal terms. The sea became his sanctuary, a place where his sick body didn't betray him and his quick mind could shine. But the touch football games were a different story. These were not gentle recreational activities. They were full-contact, no-holds-barred competitions where the Kennedys played to win and didn't much care who got hurt in the process. Jack participated, of course, he had to, but he paid for it. His back problems, already chronic by his teenage years, were aggravated by the physical punishment of these games. He learned to play through the pain, to hide his wincing, to get up after being knocked down even when every instinct told him to stay on the ground. This stoicism became a central part of his identity. Kennedys didn't complain. Kennedys didn't show weakness. Kennedys got knocked down and got back up and kept fighting until they won, or the game ended. Jack internalized this lesson so thoroughly that it became almost pathological. He would endure pain that would have sidelined most people, push through illness that would have kept most people in bed, maintain a facade of health and vigor that bore almost no relationship to his actual physical condition. The consequences of this stoicism would become clear later, when his health problems escalated and his determination to hide them led to increasingly elaborate deceptions. But in childhood and adolescence, it was simply how things were done. You didn't talk about pain. You didn't acknowledge weakness. You smiled and competed and pretended everything was fine even when it wasn't. Especially when it wasn't. Rose Kennedy, for all her organizational efficiency, was not a warm mother. She showed her love through structure and discipline, through ensuring her children had every educational advantage, through maintaining the household with military precision. But she was not the kind of mother who hugged her children frequently, who sat with them when they were sick, who provided the emotional nurturing that modern parenting experts consider essential. She had 9 children and a husband with roving eyes and enormous ambitions. There simply wasn't time for extensive emotional bonding with each child. Jack, who spent more time sick in bed than his siblings, may have felt this absence of maternal warmth more acutely than the others. Certainly his relationships with women later in life suggest someone who was searching for something he never quite found. Intimacy, perhaps, or the unconditional love that should come from a mother but didn't quite materialize in the Kennedy household. But that's speculation, the kind of psychological interpretation that historians should approach carefully. What we know for certain is that Rose was not demonstratively affectionate, and Jack grew up in a household where achievement mattered more than emotional connection. Joseph Sr. was a different kind of absent presence. He was intensely involved in his children's lives, setting expectations, monitoring progress, demanding excellence. But he was also frequently away, pursuing business interests and eventually political appointments that took him far from home. When he was present, he dominated the household with his personality and his opinions. When he was absent, his expectations remained, a constant pressure that the children felt whether he was physically there or not. The relationship between Jack and his father was complicated. Joseph Sr. clearly preferred Joe Jr., who was more like him, aggressive, driven, naturally dominant. Jack was softer, more intellectual, more inclined toward humor and reflection than action and ambition. But Joseph Sr. was also a pragmatist who could recognize talent when he saw it. As Jack grew older and began to demonstrate his own capabilities, particularly his writing ability and his understanding of politics and history, his father started to see potential there too. Not the same potential as Joe Jr., perhaps, but something worth cultivating. This gradual recognition didn't eliminate the preference for the eldest son, but it did create a slightly more complex dynamic. Jack was no longer just the sickly second son who couldn't keep up. He was becoming someone in his own right, someone with distinctive abilities that might prove useful to the family's ambitions. Joseph Sr. began including Jack in political discussions, seeking his opinions, treating him as something more than just Joe Jr.'s backup. But all of this was overshadowed during Jack's teenage years and early 20s by the gathering storm in Europe. Joseph Kennedy's appointment as ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1938 brought the entire family into contact with the forces that would reshape the 20th century. The Kennedy children, those old enough to understand what was happening, witnessed the final years of peace in Europe, the desperate attempts at appeasement, the growing certainty that war was coming. For Jack, this experience was transformative. Here was history happening in real time, not in the books he read during his sick days, but in the streets and capitals of Europe. He travelled extensively during his father's ambassadorship, visiting not just Britain but France, Germany, the Soviet Union and other countries. He saw fascism up close. He met people who would become important historical figures. He developed the interest in international affairs that would eventually shape his presidency. His senior thesis at Harvard, which became the book Why England Slept, was a direct result of this experience. It was an analysis of why Britain had failed to prepare adequately for war with Nazi Germany, examining the political and psychological factors that led to the policy of appeasement. The book was sophisticated for a work by a 23-year-old, showing real insight into the complexities of democratic politics and the challenges of preparing for war in a society that desperately wanted peace. The success of Why England Slept gave Jack something he had never had before: an achievement that was entirely his own, something his brother couldn't match. Joe Jr. was impressive in many ways, but he hadn't written a best-selling book. For the first time in his life, Jack had surpassed his golden brother in something that mattered. It was a small crack in the established order, a hint that the second son might have capabilities that the first son lacked. But war was coming, and both brothers would be tested in ways that would make their childhood competitions seem trivial. Joe Jr. would become a naval aviator, and Jack, despite his medical problems, would find his way into the Navy as well. Both would serve with distinction. Only one would come home. The seeds planted in childhood, the competition, the drive to prove himself, the determination to overcome physical limitations, would all bear fruit in the war years. Jack Kennedy would become a genuine hero, his exploits with PT-109 becoming the stuff of legend. But that's a story for later. For now, we're still in the formative years, still watching a sickly child become a complex young man, still tracing the origins of a personality that would eventually captivate a nation. What matters, as we leave this chapter of his life, is understanding the foundation that was laid in these early years. The Kennedy family, with all its wealth and ambition and dysfunction, created a particular kind of person, driven, competitive, charming, secretive, determined to succeed despite obstacles, skilled at maintaining a public image that diverged significantly from private reality. Jack Kennedy emerged from this crucible carrying all of these traits, along with a body that would continue to fail him in ways the public would never fully understand. The sickly child in a competitive family, the second son in the shadow of a golden brother, the young man who learned to hide his pain and smile through his suffering. All of these were John F. Kennedy in the making, the raw material from which a president would eventually be shaped. The transformation was far from complete. There was much more suffering ahead, much more achieving, much more hiding of the truth behind a carefully constructed facade. But the essential patterns were established here, in childhood, in a household where excellence was demanded and weakness was forbidden, where a boy with a broken body learned that the only acceptable response to pain was to ignore it and keep moving forward. That's the Kennedy way. That's what Jack learned in those early years. And that's what he carried with him through college, through war, through politics, all the way to the White House and beyond. The sickly child became the vigorous president, but he never really stopped being sick, never really stopped struggling, never really closed that gap between the image he projected and the reality he lived. Understanding this, understanding where it came from and how it was formed, is essential to understanding everything that followed in John F. Kennedy's remarkable, tragic, fascinating life. So we've established that young Jack Kennedy was not exactly the picture of robust health. But here's the thing. What we've covered so far was just the warm-up act. The childhood illnesses, the mysterious stomach problems, the chronic back pain that started in his teenage years, all of that was merely a preview of the medical odyssey that would define his adult life. Because as bad as things were in his youth, they were about to get considerably worse. And by worse, I mean the kind of worse that would have most people checking into a hospital and never leaving. Jack Kennedy naturally decided to run for president instead. Let's start with what might be the most significant of his many medical conditions, Addison's disease. Now, unless you're a medical professional or have a particular interest in endocrinology, you've probably never heard of Addison's disease, which is exactly how the Kennedy family wanted it. This condition is a disorder of the adrenal glands, those small triangular organs that sit on top of your kidneys and produce hormones that are, as it turns out, rather essential for staying alive. In Addison's disease, the adrenal glands don't produce enough of these hormones, particularly cortisol and aldosterone. The result is a cascade of symptoms that can range from annoying to fatal, depending on severity and treatment. The symptoms of Addison's disease read like a greatest hits compilation of everything that had been plaguing Jack Kennedy for years. Chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, weight loss, low blood pressure, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and a distinctive darkening of the skin, particularly in sun-exposed areas. Before effective treatment became available, Addison's disease was essentially a death sentence. Most patients didn't survive more than a few years after diagnosis. The condition slowly depleted the body's ability to handle stress, fight infection, and maintain basic metabolic functions. It was, to put it bluntly, not compatible with a long and active life. Jack Kennedy was probably suffering from Addison's disease long before it was formally diagnosed. Those childhood illnesses, the chronic stomach problems, the mysterious fatigue. Many of these symptoms make more sense when viewed through the lens of adrenal insufficiency. But the formal diagnosis didn't come until 1947, when Jack was 30 years old, already a congressman, and very much in the public eye. The diagnosis came during a trip to England, where he became so ill that a doctor examining him gave him less than a year to live. Less than a year. The man who would become president in just over a decade was told he'd be dead before his next birthday. Fortunately, medical science was advancing rapidly in the post-war years. In 1949, just 2 years after Kennedy's grim diagnosis, researchers developed synthetic cortisone, a replacement for the cortisol that his adrenal glands couldn't produce. This was nothing short of a miracle for Addison's patients. Where the disease had once been fatal, it could now be managed with daily hormone replacement therapy. Jack Kennedy became one of the first patients to benefit from this breakthrough. He would take cortisone and later other corticosteroids for the rest of his life. Without these medications, he would have died decades before Dallas. But here's where things get complicated, because cortisone wasn't a cure, it was a treatment, and it came with its own set of problems. Long-term corticosteroid use has serious side effects, many of which would compound Kennedy's existing health issues in ways that created a kind of medical domino effect. Steroids can cause osteoporosis, weakening the bones. They can suppress the immune system, making infections more likely. They can affect mood and mental state, sometimes causing anxiety, depression, or even psychotic episodes. They can cause fluid retention, weight gain, and changes in fat distribution. In short, the medication that was keeping Jack Kennedy alive was also slowly damaging his body in other ways. The Kennedy family went to extraordinary lengths to hide the Addison's diagnosis from the public. In the 1950s and 1960s, chronic illness was seen as a disqualifying weakness for political candidates. Americans wanted their leaders to be strong, vigorous, healthy, not dependent on daily medication just to function. If word got out that Jack Kennedy had Addison's disease, his political career would be over before it really began. So the family lied. They denied. They obfuscated. When reporters asked about Kennedy's health, they were told he had adrenal insufficiency caused by wartime malaria, a much more acceptable narrative than a chronic, incurable disease. This deception required constant management. Kennedy had to take his medications secretly, hiding the pills and injections that kept him alive from anyone who might talk. His doctors were sworn to confidentiality. His medical records were guarded more closely than state secrets. The entire operation was a masterclass in image management, the kind of careful, calculated deception that would become a Kennedy trademark. The public saw a young, vigorous politician with a winning smile and boundless energy. What they didn't see was the man who needed multiple daily medications just to get out of bed, who lived with the knowledge that without modern medicine, he'd already be dead. But Addison's disease was only one piece of the puzzle. Remember that chronic back pain we mentioned earlier? It was getting worse. Much, much worse. The exact cause of Kennedy's back problems has been debated by medical historians, but the symptoms were undeniable. By his 30s, Jack Kennedy was living with spinal pain so severe that it affected virtually every aspect of his daily life. He couldn't sit comfortably for long periods. He couldn't stand without discomfort. He had difficulty bending, twisting, or performing basic physical activities that most people take for granted. The back problems had started in his youth, possibly from a football injury at Choate or Harvard, possibly from the general physical fragility that characterized his early years. They were aggravated by his wartime service, the PT-109 incident, where his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer and he spent hours swimming in the Pacific while towing an injured crewmate, did no favors to an already compromised spine. After the war, the pain became progressively more debilitating. By the time he was in Congress, Kennedy was using crutches when he thought no one was watching, relying on them to get around but carefully putting them aside before any public appearance. In 1954, Kennedy made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolhardy, depending on how you look at it. He decided to have spinal surgery. Now, spinal surgery is risky for anyone, but for someone with Addison's disease, it was practically suicidal. The steroids Kennedy was taking suppressed his immune system and impaired his body's ability to heal. The stress of major surgery could trigger an Addisonian crisis, a potentially fatal drop in cortisol levels that the body couldn't compensate for. His doctors at the Leahy Clinic in Boston told him the surgery had a significant chance of killing him. They recommended against it. Kennedy did it anyway. He later told a friend that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life on crutches. This wasn't just Kennedy bravado, though there was certainly some of that involved. It was also a practical political calculation. A senator on crutches couldn't project the image of vigor and health that Kennedy needed for his presidential ambitions. The surgery was a gamble, his life against his political future, and Kennedy decided the gamble was worth taking. The surgery, performed in October 1954, was a disaster. The procedure itself went reasonably well, but the recovery was catastrophic. Kennedy developed a massive infection at the surgical site, exactly the complication his doctors had feared given his compromised immune system. He slipped into a coma. A priest was called to administer last rites, not once, but twice. The Kennedy family gathered, preparing to say goodbye to their son and brother. Newspapers had obituaries ready to print. For days, it seemed certain that Jack Kennedy would die on that hospital bed, his political career ending not in the White House but in a surgical ward in New York. But he didn't die. Against all odds, against medical probability, Kennedy fought his way back. The recovery took months. He remained hospitalized until December, then was transferred to the family home in Palm Beach to continue recuperating. A second surgery was required in February 1955 to remove a metal plate that had become infected. More months of recovery followed. For most of 1954 and much of 1955, Jack Kennedy was essentially an invalid, lying in bed, managing pain, fighting infection, and wondering if he would ever be well enough to resume his career. It was during this long recovery that Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage, his Pulitzer Prize-winning book about senators who had risked their careers for principle. Or rather, it was during this period that the book was assembled. The extent of Kennedy's personal authorship has been debated by historians, with evidence suggesting that his speechwriter Ted Sorensen did much of the actual writing. But regardless of who held the pen, the book's themes of political courage and sacrifice resonated with a man who was literally risking his life for his ambitions. The surgeries didn't fix Kennedy's back. Not really. They provided some relief, but the underlying problems persisted. For the rest of his life, Kennedy would manage chronic spinal pain through a combination of treatments that would make a modern pain management specialist raise their eyebrows. He wore a back brace almost constantly, a rigid corset-like device that provided support but also limited his movement. He used a rocking chair, finding that the gentle motion was easier on his spine than sitting still. He received regular injections of Procaine, a local anesthetic, directly into his back to numb the worst of the pain. And he took medications. Lots and lots of medications. This is where the Kennedy medical story goes from merely dramatic to genuinely astonishing, because the pharmaceutical regimen this man was on would be considered aggressive by any standard. Let's run through some of what we know Kennedy was taking during various points in his adult life, keeping in mind that this list may be incomplete since the full medical records have never been fully released. Corticosteroids for the Addison's disease, first cortisone, later prednisone, and other synthetic steroids. These were the baseline, the medications that kept him alive. He took them daily, adjusting the dosage based on stress levels and health conditions. Before major events or stressful situations, he would sometimes take extra doses to ensure his body could handle the strain. The steroids affected his appearance, contributing to the slightly puffy face that was visible in photographs, though clever lighting and camera angles helped minimize this effect. For pain management, Kennedy took codeine and Demerol, both powerful opioid painkillers. These weren't occasional medications for bad days, they were regular features of his pharmaceutical routine. The back pain was constant enough that constant medication was required to manage it. Kennedy took these drugs while serving in Congress, while running for president, while sitting in the Oval Office making decisions that affected millions of lives. The idea of a president regularly taking opioid painkillers might seem alarming today, but in Kennedy's era, such medications were prescribed more freely, and the concept of opioid crisis was decades in the future. He also took Ritalin, the stimulant now commonly prescribed for ADHD. In Kennedy's case, it wasn't for attention issues, it was to counteract the sedating effects of the painkillers and to provide energy when his adrenal insufficient body couldn't generate enough on its own. So here's the picture. A man taking steroids to stay alive, opioids to manage pain, and stimulants to stay alert enough to function despite the opioids. It's a pharmaceutical balancing act that would challenge any patient, let alone one trying to lead the free world. But wait, there's more. Kennedy also took testosterone injections, probably to counteract some of the effects of his other medications and his underlying conditions. He took antibiotics periodically to fight the infections his compromised immune system couldn't handle on its own. He took antispasmodics for his persistent gastrointestinal issues. He took barbiturates and other sedatives to help him sleep, since the stimulants and steroids could cause insomnia. At various points, he was reportedly taking antipsychotic medications to manage mood changes caused by the steroids. Some historians estimate that Kennedy was taking up to 12 different medications simultaneously during certain periods of his presidency. 12. Let that sink in. The man with his finger on the nuclear button, the man who would guide America through the Cuban Missile Crisis, was managing a pharmaceutical regimen that would give a pharmacy computer system pause. And he was doing it while maintaining the public image of youthful vigor, projecting energy and health, even as his body was being held together by a cocktail of drugs that would fill a small suitcase. The logistics of managing all these medications were themselves a challenge. Kennedy had a personal physician, Dr. Janet Travel, who traveled with him and administered many of his treatments. She was the one who gave him those procaine injections, sometimes multiple times a day. She was the one who adjusted his medication dosages based on his schedule and stress levels. She was also, it should be noted, something of a controversial figure in medical circles. Her approach to Kennedy's treatment was considered aggressive by some of her colleagues, and there were concerns about the long-term effects of some of her protocols. Then there was Dr. Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood, who provided Kennedy with injections of what Jacobson called vitamin mixtures, but which actually contained amphetamines and other stimulants. Jacobson's treatments gave Kennedy bursts of energy and euphoria, but were potentially dangerous, especially given all the other medications Kennedy was taking. When Robert Kennedy found out about Jacobson's involvement, he was reportedly furious and demanded that the injections stop. Whether they actually stopped is unclear. Jacobson remained part of Kennedy's medical entourage until the assassination. The physical toll of all these conditions and treatments was visible to those who knew Kennedy well, even if the public never saw it. His weight fluctuated depending on his medication regimen. His face would swell from the steroids, then thin out when dosages were adjusted. He walked stiffly, carefully, always conscious of his back. He used specially designed furniture. That famous rocking chair wasn't just a folksy affectation, it was a medical necessity. His mattresses were specially constructed for back support. His shoes were sometimes built up on one side to correct imbalances in his gait. The osteoporosis caused by long-term steroid use was devastating. Kennedy's bones became so fragile, so weakened by years of corticosteroid therapy, that simple activities became dangerous. There are reports that his spine was so deteriorated that he couldn't bend over to tie his own shoes. Putting on a sock on his left foot, a task most of us accomplish without conscious thought, was beyond his physical capability. He needed assistance with basic dressing activities that most able-bodied adults manage without thinking. The President of the United States couldn't put on his own socks. That's not a metaphor for political helplessness. It's a literal physical limitation that he lived with every day. Think about what that means for a moment. Every morning before the meetings and the briefings and the decisions that shaped world history, John Fair, Kennedy had to be helped with getting dressed. Someone had to assist him with the simple, dignified act of putting on his clothes. For a man who projected such an image of vigor and capability, for someone whose political brand was youth and energy and strength, this daily reminder of his physical limitations must have been psychologically brutal. Yet he never complained publicly, never sought sympathy, never let the facade crack. The back brace he wore constantly deserves special mention, not just because it was uncomfortable and restricting, but because of its role in his death. When the first bullet struck him in the upper back, the brace prevented him from slumping forward or falling to the side, movements that might have taken him out of the line of fire. Instead, held upright by the brace, he remained a stationary target for the second, fatal shot to the head. The medical device that had helped him function for years may have contributed to his death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point here is that Kennedy's daily existence was a constant negotiation with pain, medication, and physical limitation. He lived in a body that was actively working against him, managed only through a pharmaceutical arsenal and constant medical attention. And he did this while maintaining one of the most demanding jobs in the world, making decisions that affected hundreds of millions of people, projecting an image of health and vigor that was almost entirely manufactured. The psychological burden of this deception is hard to overstate. Kennedy had to lie constantly, to the press, to the public, sometimes even to close associates, about his health. He had to smile through pain, project energy he didn't feel, maintain appearances at all costs. The gap between his public image and private reality was vast, and maintaining that gap required constant vigilance. Every public appearance was a performance. Every display of vigor was calculated. Every time he bounded up the stairs of Air Force One or played touch football with his family, he was putting on a show, often paying for it later with increased pain and medication adjustments. His wife Jackie understood, at least partially. She knew about the medications, the treatments, the daily struggle to function. She accommodated his needs, learned to work around his limitations, helped maintain the facade when necessary. But even she may not have known the full extent of his medical challenges. Some historians believe Kennedy kept details of his condition secret even from his closest family members, either out of pride or out of a desire to protect them from worry. The medical team around Kennedy became expert at managing not just his health but his image. They learned to schedule demanding events for times when his energy was highest, to ensure medication doses were timed for optimal effect during important meetings, to have emergency treatments ready when his body started to fail. It was a choreographed performance, repeated daily, with the stakes being nothing less than the presidency of the United States. What's remarkable is that Kennedy managed to be an effective president despite all of this. The Cuban Missile Crisis, widely regarded as the most dangerous moment in human history, was managed by a man who was taking multiple medications for multiple serious conditions. Kennedy's performance during those 13 days in October 1962 was by all accounts calm, measured, and thoughtful. Exactly the qualities you'd want in a leader facing potential nuclear war. Whatever cocktail of drugs was coursing through his system, it didn't prevent him from thinking clearly when clarity mattered most. This raises interesting questions about the relationship between illness and capability. The conventional wisdom says that serious health problems disqualify someone from high office, that physical limitation translates to mental limitation. Kennedy proved this wrong, at least in his own case. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp. His judgment wasn't impaired by his medications, or if it wasn't impaired in ways that affected his decision-making during crucial moments. He was sick, he was medicated, and he was still one of the most effective presidents of the 20th century. Or maybe his illness actually contributed to his effectiveness in some ways. Kennedy was intimately familiar with mortality, having faced death multiple times. This awareness might have given him perspective that healthier leaders lacked. When you've been given last rites twice, when you've lived for years knowing that a single missed medication could kill you, nuclear war might seem less abstract, more real, more urgent to avoid. Kennedy's famous coolness under pressure during the missile crisis might have been partly a product of his experience with life-threatening situations. He'd been close to death before, and he'd learned to function anyway. His illness also forced him to develop certain skills that served him well in politics. He learned patience from all those months of recovery. He learned to conserve energy, to focus on what mattered, to delegate when necessary. He learned to read people, partly from all that time observing doctors and gauging whether they were telling him the truth about his condition. He learned to hide his true feelings, to present a face to the world that didn't match his internal reality. These are all useful skills for a politician, even if they were developed in the most painful way possible. The medications themselves might have had some beneficial effects on his political persona, though this is speculative. The steroids could cause a kind of mild euphoria and confidence that might have contributed to Kennedy's famous charisma. The stimulants certainly helped him maintain the demanding schedule of a presidential campaign and a presidency. Some historians have suggested that the combination of drugs Kennedy was taking actually enhanced his performance in some ways, even as they were damaging his body. It's a disturbing thought, but not an implausible one. What's certain is that Kennedy's medical condition was far more serious than the public ever knew, and that the deception required to hide it was extensive and ongoing. This raises ethical questions that are still debated today. Should the public have been told? Does a president have a right to medical privacy, or do voters deserve to know about conditions that might affect a leader's judgment? Kennedy, but was that deception justified? There are no easy answers to these questions. Kennedy's supporters argue that his health didn't actually impair his job performance, so the deception was harmless. Voters got a capable president regardless of his medical secrets. Critics argue that voters have a right to make informed decisions, and that Kennedy's deception undermined democratic principles. The truth is probably somewhere in between, complicated by the fact that medical privacy norms were different in Kennedy's era, and that public attitudes toward chronic illness have evolved significantly since then. What we can say is that Kennedy's experience reveals something important about the human capacity for endurance. This was a man who was told he'd be dead within a year, who underwent multiple near-fatal surgeries, who lived with constant pain and a pharmaceutical regimen that would challenge any patient. And yet he not only survived but thrived, achieving the highest office in the land and acquitting himself with distinction during some of the most challenging moments of the Cold War. Whatever else Kennedy was, Flawed husband, shrewd politician, inspiring leader, he was undeniably resilient. His body tried to kill him repeatedly, and he refused to let it. The hidden battle that Kennedy fought every day of his adult life was, in many ways, more impressive than his public achievements. Anyone can campaign for president if they're healthy and energetic. Try doing it when you can barely put on your own socks. Anyone can handle the Cuban Missile Crisis if they're operating at full physical capacity. Try doing it while managing 12 different medications and chronic pain that would have most people bedridden. Kennedy's political accomplishments are remarkable on their own terms, but they become almost superhuman when you understand what he was fighting against just to show up every day. This is the man behind the legend, not just the charming smile and the inspiring speeches, but the constant pain, the secret medications, the body that was slowly falling apart even as he projected an image of youthful vigor. Understanding this hidden battle is essential to understanding Kennedy as a person, not just as a political icon. He was human, fragile, mortal, more so than most people realized. And yet he kept going, kept fighting, kept performing the role of healthy, vigorous leader even when the performance was slowly killing him. The medications, the treatments, the daily struggle, all of it was hidden from public view, maintained behind a wall of secrecy that only crumbled decades after Kennedy's death. When his medical records finally began to emerge in the 1990s and 2000s, historians and the public were shocked by the extent of his health problems. The gap between the Kennedy image and the Kennedy reality was even larger than skeptics had suspected. The vigorous young president had been, in medical terms, a very sick man holding himself together through sheer will and pharmaceutical intervention. And that perhaps is the most important thing to understand about Kennedy's hidden health battle. It wasn't just about the diseases or the medications. It was about the determination to live a full life despite them. Kennedy refused to be defined by his limitations, refused to let his body's betrayals dictate what he could achieve. He pushed through pain that would have stopped most people, maintained a schedule that would have exhausted healthy individuals, and projected an image of strength that was almost entirely at odds with his physical reality. Was this healthy in the psychological sense? Probably not. The constant deception, the refusal to acknowledge vulnerability, the performance of health when health was absent, these things take a toll on anyone. Kennedy paid for his public vigor with private suffering, and the medications he took to maintain his performance were slowly damaging his body in ways that would have eventually caught up with him, even if Dallas hadn't happened. He was running a deficit, borrowing energy and capability from a body that couldn't really afford to lend it. But he did it anyway. That's the Kennedy way, the lesson he learned in that competitive household where weakness was unacceptable. You didn't complain about pain. You smiled, you performed, you kept going no matter what. Jack Kennedy took that lesson to its extreme conclusion, maintaining a facade of health through conditions that would have defeated most people, accomplishing things that seemed impossible for someone in his physical state. The hidden battle was constant, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable. But Kennedy fought it every day for decades, and the fact that most people never knew about it is testament to how well he fought. The charming, vigorous president they saw on television and in photographs was real in one sense. That persona did exist, was maintained consistently, performed the duties of the office effectively. But it was also a creation, a carefully constructed image that bore only a passing resemblance to the physical reality of the man producing it. John F. Kennedy was a masterpiece of medical management and personal determination, a man who refused to let his broken body define his life. He lived with chronic illness, constant pain, and a pharmaceutical regimen that seems almost unbelievable by modern standards. And he did it all while hiding the truth from almost everyone, maintaining an image that served his political ambitions but required constant, exhausting effort to sustain. That's the hidden battle. That's what Kennedy was really fighting every day, behind the smiles and the speeches and the inspiring calls to public service. A battle against his own body, against limitations he refused to accept, against a reality he couldn't afford to acknowledge. He won that battle in the sense that he achieved everything he set out to achieve despite the odds against him. But he also lost it, in the sense that the battle never ended, never could end, until a bullet in Dallas made all his medical struggles suddenly, tragically irrelevant. The man who couldn't put on his own socks led the free world through its most dangerous moment. The man taking 12 different medications made the decisions that shaped the modern era. The man who was told he'd be dead within a year became one of the most beloved presidents in American history. That's the paradox of John F. Kennedy's health, Devastating limitation and extraordinary achievement, hidden suffering and public triumph, a broken body housing an unbroken will. Understanding this doesn't diminish Kennedy's accomplishments. If anything, it makes them more impressive. He achieved what he achieved not because he was blessed with health and vigor, but despite being cursed with illness and pain. Every day was a battle, every public appearance a performance, every achievement a victory over a body that wanted nothing more than to rest, to stop, to give up the fight. Kennedy refused. And whatever else you think about him, his politics, his personal life, his legacy, that refusal, that determination, that absolute unwillingness to let his limitations define him is something remarkable. The hidden battle shaped the man, and the man shaped history. You can't understand one without understanding the other. And now that we've explored what Kennedy was fighting against every day of his adult life, we can better appreciate both the public accomplishments and the private costs, the price he paid, in pain and medication and constant vigilance, for the privilege of leading the nation through one of its most challenging eras. But let's go deeper into the daily reality of living with these conditions, because the devil really is in the details. Consider what Kennedy's typical morning might have looked like during his presidency. He would wake up, assuming the sleeping medications had worn off enough to allow him to wake naturally, which wasn't always the case, and immediately face the challenge of getting out of bed. For most of us, this is an automatic process, something we do without conscious thought. For Kennedy, with his deteriorated spine and chronic pain, it was a careful, deliberate operation that had to be managed to avoid triggering muscle spasms or acute pain episodes. Once out of bed, there was the medication routine. The corticosteroids had to be taken at specific times to maintain stable hormone levels. The timing mattered. Take them too late and you'd feel the effects of adrenal insufficiency. Take them too early, and you might disrupt the body's already compromised circadian rhythms. Then there were the painkillers, calibrated to provide relief without too much sedation, especially if there were important meetings scheduled. Then possibly the stimulants to counteract the sedation. Then the various other medications addressing various other symptoms. Kennedy's bathroom probably looked less like a presidential suite and more like a small pharmacy. The physical therapy routine was another daily obligation. Doctor, Travel had developed a series of exercises and treatments designed to maintain whatever mobility Kennedy still had and prevent further deterioration. There were stretches for the back, exercises for core strength, procedures to address muscle tension and trigger points. Kennedy had a specially designed bedboard that he traveled with, because sleeping on the wrong mattress could leave him unable to function the next day. He had specific chairs that he could sit in, because ordinary furniture put too much strain on his spine. The rocking chair became his signature, partly because the motion helped alleviate back pain. The gentle rocking kept muscles from seizing up the way they would if he sat still. The Procaine injections deserve more detailed discussion because they were a central part of Kennedy's pain management strategy. Procaine is a local anesthetic similar to the Novocaine your dentist uses. Doctor. Travel would inject it directly into Kennedy's back muscles, targeting specific trigger points where pain was concentrated. The relief was immediate but temporary. The numbness would last for a few hours, then the pain would return requiring another injection. On bad days, Kennedy might receive multiple injections. During periods of high stress or demanding schedules, he might be getting these shots several times a day. The injection sites would become sore over time, and there was always the risk of infection, a particular concern given Kennedy's compromised immune system. The steroids he was taking suppressed his body's ability to fight bacteria, meaning that any break in the skin was an opportunity for infection. His medical team had to be constantly vigilant, watching for signs of complications that in a healthy person would be minor inconveniences, but in Kennedy could become serious problems. Hot baths became an essential part of his routine. Kennedy took multiple baths a day when possible, finding that the heat relaxed his back muscles and provided temporary relief from the constant tension. The White House swimming pool, heated to therapeutic temperatures, was another crucial resource. Kennedy swam regularly, finding that the buoyancy of the water took pressure off his spine and allowed him to exercise without the jarring impact of land-based activities. The pool was kept warmer than typical recreational temperatures, optimized for therapeutic rather than athletic purposes. His clothing was modified to accommodate his physical limitations. The back brace, which he wore almost constantly during his presidency, was a substantial garment. Not the discreet elastic bands you might imagine, but a rigid corset-like device that wrapped around his torso and severely limited his range of motion. Getting dressed required assistance, and the process had to be carefully managed to avoid triggering pain. His suits were tailored to conceal the brace's bulk, and his shirts were designed to accommodate it while still looking normal. The famous Kennedy style, the well-cut suits, the careful grooming, was partly a function of necessity, since every aspect of his appearance had to be engineered to hide his physical limitations. The famous vigor, the energetic image that Kennedy projected, was the product of careful staging and timing. Public appearances were scheduled around his medication cycles, timed for periods when the drugs would be at maximum effectiveness. Long events were broken up with rest periods that the public never saw. His staff learned to recognize the signs of fatigue or increasing pain, and would find ways to cut events short or provide Kennedy with opportunities to sit down and recover. The image of boundless energy was a collaborative production, maintained by a team of people who understood what was at stake if the truth ever came out. Travel was particularly challenging. The vibration and movement of cars, planes, and helicopters aggravated Kennedy's back pain. He had to use specialized cushions and seating arrangements, and even with these accommodations, long trips left him exhausted and sore. The presidential airplane, Air Force One, was modified with features designed to ease his comfort, but there was only so much that could be done. Every campaign trip, every diplomatic mission, every journey to Camp David or the Kennedy compound exacted a physical toll that had to be paid back in pain and recovery time. The White House itself was adapted to Kennedy's needs in ways that visitors rarely noticed. The mattresses on his bed were specially designed. His chairs were positioned and selected for optimal back support. The routes he walked through the building were planned to minimize the distance he had to travel. When he appeared in public areas, he often used a back entrance or elevator that allowed him to avoid stairs. Those famous images of Kennedy bounding upstairs were carefully chosen moments when he had the energy and medication support to perform that action, not representative of his typical mobility. His diet was also affected by his medical conditions. The gastrointestinal issues that had plagued him since childhood continued into his presidency, requiring careful attention to what he ate. Certain foods would trigger digestive problems that could derail his entire day. His staff maintained lists of safe foods and problematic foods, and his meals were planned accordingly. Jackie Kennedy personally monitored his diet, leaving handwritten notes with instructions about what he should and shouldn't eat. "Nothing fried," one such note reportedly said, a simple instruction that reflected the constant background management required to keep Kennedy functioning. The stress of the presidency, of course, made everything worse. Stress is particularly dangerous for someone with Addison's disease, because the adrenal glands are supposed to produce extra cortisol during stressful periods to help the body cope. Kennedy's glands couldn't do this, so he had to compensate with medication. Before known stressful events, major speeches, difficult meetings, international crises, his medication doses would be adjusted upward. His medical team had to anticipate his needs, because by the time stress symptoms appeared, it might be too late to effectively address them. The Cuban Missile Crisis, those 13 days in October 1962 when the world came closest to nuclear war, is a case study in managing presidential health during extreme stress. Kennedy was taking extra steroids to handle the pressure, along with his usual cocktail of other medications. He was sleeping only a few hours a night, or not sleeping at all, which compounded the physical strain. His back pain was reportedly severe throughout the crisis, managed with increased procaine injections and painkillers. And yet, by all accounts, his judgment remained sound. He resisted pressure from military advisors who wanted a more aggressive response. He kept open channels of communication with the Soviets, and he found a diplomatic solution that avoided nuclear war. How did he do it? Some historians credit the medications themselves, the stimulants that kept him alert, the steroids that maintained his physiological stability. Others point to Kennedy's experience with crisis, his familiarity with life-threatening situations from his medical history. Still others suggest that his illness had taught him patience and the value of careful decision-making, qualities that served him well when impulsive action might have led to catastrophe. Whatever the explanation, Kennedy's performance during the missile crisis suggests that his health problems, whatever their severity, didn't prevent him from functioning effectively when it mattered most. But functioning effectively came at a cost. After the missile crisis was resolved, Kennedy reportedly collapsed into exhaustion, his body finally demanding payment for the extraordinary effort of those 13 days. The adrenaline that had kept him going, artificial adrenaline in his case from the medications, couldn't be sustained indefinitely. His recovery from the crisis took weeks, during which his public schedule was reduced and his physical limitations became more pronounced. The crisis was over, but the toll it had exacted on his already compromised body would never be fully repaid. This pattern repeated throughout his presidency. Major events, speeches, summits, crises, would require peak performance that his body could only achieve through pharmaceutical intervention. After each peak, there would be a trough, a period of increased pain and fatigue as his body recovered from the demands placed on it. His staff learned to plan around these cycles, scheduling lighter duties after demanding events, building in recovery time that the public never knew about. The presidency was, for Kennedy, a constant oscillation between performance and recuperation, public vigor and private collapse. The mental health aspects of Kennedy's pharmaceutical regimen are worth considering as well. Corticosteroids can cause mood changes, ranging from mild euphoria to severe depression to outright psychosis. Kennedy reportedly experienced mood swings that his inner circle learned to recognize and accommodate. There were periods when he was unusually irritable, periods when he seemed unexpectedly elated, periods when his decision-making seemed more impulsive than usual. His doctors adjusted his medications to try to minimize these effects, but they couldn't eliminate them entirely. Jackie Kennedy believed that some of her husband's psychological issues were caused by antihistamines he was taking for allergies. Whether this was accurate or whether she was looking for explanations that didn't involve the more serious medications her husband was taking is unclear. What is clear is that the people closest to Kennedy were aware that his pharmaceutical regimen affected his mental state, and they factored this into their interactions with him. The president's mood was, to some extent, a managed variable, subject to pharmaceutical adjustment like so many other aspects of his health. The secrecy surrounding all of this created its own psychological burden. Kennedy lived with the knowledge that if the truth about his health came out, his political career would be over. Every day was a performance, every public appearance a potential moment of exposure. He had to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware of what might reveal his true condition. A grimace of pain at the wrong moment, a stumble captured by cameras, a prescription bottle spotted by a reporter. Any of these could unravel the carefully constructed image he had spent years building. This constant need for concealment must have been exhausting in its own right. Kennedy couldn't complain about his pain, couldn't ask for sympathy, couldn't let down his guard even among most of his staff. The number of people who knew the full extent of his health problems was deliberately kept small, and even those in the inner circle probably didn't know everything. Kennedy carried his medical secrets largely alone, sharing them fully with no one, maintaining the facade even when it might have been easier to ask for help. The irony is that Kennedy's determination to hide his illness may have made it worse. Seeking more aggressive treatment would have required acknowledging the severity of his condition. Resting when he needed to rest would have revealed his limitations. Taking time to properly recover from surgeries or illness would have raised questions he couldn't answer. So Kennedy pushed forward, maintained his schedule, projected his image, and paid for it with accelerated physical decline. The same drive that made him successful was also, in a very real sense, killing him. His doctors faced an impossible situation. They knew Kennedy was taking on more than his body could handle. They knew the medications they were giving him had serious long-term consequences. They knew that the schedule he was maintaining was not sustainable for someone with his health profile. But Kennedy refused to slow down, and ultimately the doctor's job was to help him do what he was determined to do, not to talk him out of it. They managed his decline as best they could, providing the pharmaceutical support he needed to function, while knowing that every day of high performance was borrowed against a future that would eventually come due. The physical evidence of this decline was visible to those who knew what to look for. Kennedy's weight fluctuated noticeably during his presidency, ballooning when steroid doses were high, dropping when they were reduced. His face showed signs of steroid use, the slight puffiness, the sometimes altered skin coloration that makeup artists had to address for television appearances. His movements became stiffer over time as his spine deteriorated further. The contrast between Kennedy in 1960, during his presidential campaign, and Kennedy in 1963, just before his assassination, shows a man who had aged considerably more than 3 years, worn down by the constant battle his body was fighting. The medications Kennedy was taking also interacted with each other in ways that were not always predictable. The medical knowledge of drug interactions in the early 1960s was far less sophisticated than it is today, and Kennedy's doctors were in some ways experimenting, trying to find combinations that provided relief without unacceptable side effects. Some of the combinations Kennedy was taking would be considered dangerous by modern standards, with potential for serious adverse interactions. That he suffered no catastrophic pharmaceutical accident is as much a matter of luck as it is of medical skill. The role of Dr. Max Jacobson, Dr. Feelgood, remains controversial. Jacobson was not part of Kennedy's official medical team, but was brought in to provide what he called vitamin injections that actually contained amphetamines, steroids, and other stimulants. These injections provided Kennedy with bursts of energy and well-being that helped him get through demanding events. But they were also dangerous, especially given all the other medications Kennedy was taking. When Robert Kennedy learned about Jacobson's involvement, he reportedly had the injections analysed and was alarmed by what he found. Whether his intervention actually ended Jacobson's access to his brother is unclear. Some evidence suggests Jacobson continued to provide treatments until the assassination. The question of what Kennedy's long-term prognosis would have been if he hadn't been killed in Dallas is impossible to answer definitively. But the trajectory was not encouraging. His spine was continuing to deteriorate. The osteoporosis caused by long-term steroid use was progressive and irreversible. His Addison's disease required ever more careful management as his body's ability to compensate for stress diminished. Many historians believe that Kennedy's health problems would have forced him to decline a second term, or at least would have significantly limited his effectiveness during it. The assassination, in a grim irony, may have spared him a slow public decline that would have damaged his legacy in ways a dramatic death in Dallas never could. But none of this was known to the public at the time, and that's really the point of this chapter. John F. Kennedy, the vibrant young president who seemed to embody American vigor and optimism, was actually a very sick man taking a small pharmacy's worth of medications just to function. The image and the reality were almost completely disconnected, maintained apart through careful management, medical intervention, and constant vigilance. The hidden battle Kennedy fought every day was in many ways more remarkable than any of his public accomplishments, a testament to human will, to the determination to live fully even when the body has other plans. Understanding this hidden battle doesn't diminish Kennedy's achievements. If anything, it makes them more impressive. But it does complicate the simple narrative of vigorous youth that has been central to Kennedy mythology. The real Kennedy was more complex, more human, more fragile than the image suggests. He was a man who achieved extraordinary things while fighting extraordinary limitations, who projected strength while managing weakness, who led the free world while barely able to dress himself in the morning. That's the John F. Kennedy who actually existed, not the mythological figure of endless vigor, but a determined, suffering, resilient human being who refused to let his broken body determine his destiny. The hidden battle was real, constant, and ultimately defining. It shaped who Kennedy was, how he led, and how he should be remembered. Not as a perfect icon of health and vigor, but as a flawed human being who accomplished remarkable things despite, or perhaps because of, his intimate familiarity with mortality and pain. So we've established that Jack Kennedy spent a considerable amount of his youth horizontal, lying in beds, recovering from surgeries, fighting off various illnesses that kept him sidelined while his siblings were out being aggressively healthy. What we haven't fully explored is what he did with all that time. Because here's the thing about being bedridden. It's boring. Spectacularly mind-numbingly boring. You can only stare at the ceiling for so long before you start naming the cracks. And Jack Kennedy, whatever his physical limitations, had an active, curious mind that demanded stimulation. So he read. He read constantly, voraciously, obsessively. He read the way other people breathe, automatically, continuously, as a fundamental part of being alive. This wasn't casual reading, the kind where you pick up a magazine and flip through it while waiting for an appointment. This was serious, sustained intellectual engagement with some of the most challenging literature in the English language. While other boys his age were playing sports and chasing girls, activities Jack would have preferred given the choice, he was working his way through history books, biographies, poetry collections, political treatises, and anything else he could get his hands on. The enforced inactivity of his illnesses became, almost by accident, an extended education in the liberal arts, a self-directed curriculum that would shape his thinking for the rest of his life. Poetry held a particular fascination for young Jack. This might seem surprising. Poetry isn't exactly the stereotypical interest of a wealthy young man from a competitive, politically ambitious family. The Kennedy household valued achievement, action, winning. Poetry is none of those things. It's contemplative, emotional, concerned with beauty and meaning rather than victory and success. And yet Jack was drawn to it, finding in verse something that the competitive world of Kennedy football games and dinner table debates couldn't provide. Lord Byron became an early favourite, and it's not hard to see why. Byron was the original celebrity bad boy, handsome, scandalous, brilliant, and doomed. He lived fast, wrote beautiful poetry, had affairs that shocked Regency England, and died young in Greece while supporting their war of independence. For a sickly young man lying in bed and wondering what kind of life he might lead, Byron offered a romantic model of achievement despite adversity, of burning bright even if you couldn't burn long. The Byronic hero, passionate, defiant, touched by melancholy but refusing to surrender to it, resonated with something in Jack's own situation. Kennedy memorized passages of Byron's work, returning to them throughout his life. The poetry spoke to him in ways that more practical literature didn't. There's something about verse that reaches past the rational mind and touches something deeper, something emotional and intuitive. For a young man dealing with chronic illness and the constant pressure of family expectations, poetry offered a kind of solace that medical treatments couldn't provide. It was an escape, yes, but also an education in feeling, in the emotional complexity that prose often struggles to capture. Robert Frost was another poet Kennedy returned to repeatedly. Frost's work is deceptively simple on the surface. Rural New England imagery, accessible language, poems that seem like they could be understood by anyone. But beneath that surface simplicity lies profound complexity. Questions about choice and consequence, nature and humanity, the roads we take and the ones we leave behind. The Road Not Taken, perhaps Frost's most famous poem, is often misread as a celebration of individualism and bold choice-making. It's actually far more ambiguous than that, gently mocking the human tendency to impose meaning on random decisions. Kennedy, a man who would face consequential choices throughout his life, found something valuable in Frost's meditation on the stories we tell ourselves about why we do what we do. Kennedy's love of Frost would eventually become public during his presidency. He invited the elderly poet to read at his inauguration in January 1961, the first time a poet had been included in an inaugural ceremony. Frost, then 86 years old, had prepared a new poem for the occasion, but the bright winter sun made it impossible for him to read his notes. So he recited the gift outright from memory instead, his voice wavering but his words clear in the cold Washington air. It was a moment that symbolized Kennedy's commitment to culture and intellect, his belief that poetry and art had a place in American public life alongside politics and power. But Kennedy's reading wasn't limited to poetry. He devoured history, particularly military and political history. He read biographies of great leaders, Churchill, Lincoln, the Founding Fathers, studying how they had navigated crises and made decisions under pressure. He read about diplomacy and international relations, developing the understanding of global affairs that would later inform his foreign policy. He read economics, philosophy, current events. His intellectual appetite was genuinely omnivorous, consuming everything from serious academic works to popular novels. The sheer volume of his reading was remarkable, but what made it truly exceptional was the speed at which he could consume text. Kennedy was a naturally fast reader, but during his recovery from his 1954 back surgery, those long months of convalescence when he couldn't do much except lie in bed and read, he decided to formalize and improve this skill. He enrolled in a speed reading course, learning techniques to increase his reading rate while maintaining comprehension. The results were impressive by any standard. By the time he was finished with the course, Kennedy could read at approximately 1,200 words per minute. To put that in perspective, the average adult reads at about 200-300 words per minute. Kennedy was reading 4 to 6 times faster than a typical reader. This wasn't skimming or scanning, he actually absorbed and retained what he read at this pace. He could work through a dense policy document or a lengthy briefing paper in a fraction of the time it would take most people, freeing up time for other activities and allowing him to stay on top of the enormous volume of information that flows through the presidency. This speed-reading ability became almost legendary among Kennedy's staff. He would tear through stacks of newspapers every morning, quickly identifying the stories that mattered and absorbing their content. He could review briefing books for important meetings in remarkably short periods. During his presidency, when the demands on his time were enormous and the volume of material he needed to process was staggering, his reading speed was a genuine practical advantage. While other presidents might spend hours working through documents, Kennedy could accomplish the same task in a fraction of the time. The speed reading also fed his conversational abilities. Kennedy was famous for his quick wit, his ability to reference obscure facts and make unexpected connections in conversation. This wasn't just natural intelligence, it was the product of having read more than almost anyone he was likely to meet. When you've consumed thousands of books at 1,200 words per minute, you accumulate a vast reservoir of knowledge that you can draw upon in any situation. Kennedy's famous charm was partly intellectual. He could talk knowledgeably about almost any subject because he had probably read several books about it. But let's not get too romantic about Kennedy's reading habits. He wasn't some cloistered intellectual who preferred books to people. He read voraciously partly because he had to. All those hours stuck in bed had to be filled with something, and partly because reading was a practical tool for his ambitions. A politician needs to understand policy, history, economics, and human nature. Reading provided Kennedy with that understanding. It was self-improvement with a purpose, education directed toward achievement. The recovery period after his 1954 back surgery was when reading became most central to Kennedy's life. He was confined to bed for months, unable to do much of anything except read and think. This was the period when Profiles in Courage was researched and written, or at least assembled, since the extent of Kennedy's personal authorship remains debated. Kennedy read extensively about the senators he profiled, immersing himself in their lives and decisions, trying to understand what made them willing to sacrifice their careers for principle. The book that emerged from this period won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, a remarkable achievement for a relatively young senator. Whether Kennedy wrote every word himself or relied heavily on his staff, particularly his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, the book reflected genuine intellectual engagement with its subject matter. Kennedy had thought deeply about political courage, about the tension between conscience and career, about what it meant to lead. These weren't abstract questions for him. He was a politician facing his own difficult choices, and the book was partly an exploration of how others had navigated similar dilemmas. The intellectual image that Kennedy cultivated was somewhat unusual for American politicians of his era. Nixon, Kennedy's opponent in 1960, was seen as cunning and political rather than intellectual. Kennedy deliberately positioned himself differently as a thinking president, someone who valued ideas and culture alongside power and politics. He quoted poets in his speeches. He invited artists and intellectuals to the White House. He spoke about the importance of culture in American life with a seriousness that previous presidents had rarely mustered. This wasn't just image-making, though it was certainly that too. Kennedy genuinely valued intellectual life in ways that went beyond political calculation. He found real pleasure in reading, in discussion, in the exchange of ideas. The famous Kennedy wit wasn't just a political tool, it reflected a mind that was genuinely engaged with the world, that found connections and ironies that others missed. His press conferences were performances, yes, but they were performances by someone who actually enjoyed verbal sparring and quick thinking. The relationship between Kennedy's reading and his health problems is worth considering. All those hours in bed, all those recovery periods, all those times when physical activity was impossible. They forced Kennedy into an intellectual life he might not otherwise have developed. A healthier Kennedy might have been more like his brother Joe Jr., focused on athletics and action rather than books and ideas. The illness that limited his body freed his mind, gave it time and space to develop in ways that would later distinguish him from his political peers. This is one of the strange gifts that adversity sometimes provides. Kennedy's illnesses were genuine suffering, not something to romanticize, but they also created the conditions for a particular kind of growth. The young man who spent months in bed recovering from various ailments emerged with a depth of knowledge and a capacity for reflection that his healthier contemporaries often lacked. The reading wasn't compensation for what he couldn't do physically, it was its own form of achievement, its own kind of strength. Kennedy's literary interests also influenced his speaking and writing style. He wrote with a clarity and elegance that reflected his immersion in good prose. His speeches, many written with Sorensen's help but reflecting Kennedy's own sensibilities, had a rhetorical power that came from understanding how language works. The famous phrases from his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," echo the balanced, antithetical structure that Kennedy had absorbed from years of reading great prose and poetry. The books Kennedy read shaped how he saw the world and how he made decisions. His understanding of history informed his approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had read about how the miscalculations of 1914 had led to World War I, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. His reading about leadership influenced how he managed his administration. His engagement with political philosophy shaped his thinking about the relationship between government and citizens. The reading wasn't just entertainment or even education, it was preparation for the challenges he would face. Even during his presidency, when the demands on his time were enormous, Kennedy continued to read. He kept books in the Oval Office, by his bed, anywhere he might have a few minutes to spare. He stayed current with major publications, devouring newspapers and magazines with his characteristic speed. He made time for the life of the mind even when the life of action demanded almost everything he had. It was a discipline, a commitment, a fundamental part of who he was. The image of Kennedy as reader, the intellectual president, the man who valued ideas, became part of his legacy. After his death, this image was sometimes exaggerated, turned into a kind of mythology, but the underlying reality was genuine. Kennedy really did read with unusual volume and speed. He really did care about literature and ideas. He really did see intellectual engagement as an essential part of leadership. In an era when politicians often emphasized their ordinary guy credentials, Kennedy's intellectualism was unusual and, to many Americans, refreshing. Those long hours in bed, fighting illness and recovering from surgery, gave Kennedy something that couldn't be measured in athletic achievement or social success. They gave him a mind furnished with the best that had been thought and written, a capacity for reflection and analysis that would serve him well in the most demanding job in the world. The sickly boy who couldn't keep up with his siblings in touch football found another arena in which to excel, and in that arena nobody could touch him. If reading was Kennedy's refuge during his illnesses, sailing was his sanctuary when he was well enough to be active. From his earliest years at Hyannisport, Jack Kennedy loved being on the water. The sea offered him something that the competitive Kennedy household rarely provided: peace. On a sailboat, there were no dinner table debates, no sibling rivalries, no impossible expectations to meet. There was just the wind, the waves, and the simple, absorbing challenge of making a boat go where you wanted it to go. The Kennedy family had been sailing at Hyannisport since the 1920s, when Joseph Sr. bought the compound that would become the family's summer home. The waters of Nantucket Sound became the Kennedys' playground, and sailing became one of their many competitive sports. But unlike touch football or tennis, where Jack's physical limitations put him at a disadvantage, sailing was something he could genuinely excel at. On a boat, strategy and skill mattered more than raw strength. The wind didn't care about your back problems. The current didn't know you'd been sick. Jack took to sailing with a passion that surprised even his competitive family. He studied the sport seriously, learning the technical details of sail trim, wind patterns, and boat handling. He practiced constantly during summers at Hyannisport, going out in all conditions, developing the instinctive feel for wind and water that separates good sailors from great ones. By his teenage years, he was one of the best sailors in the family, which, given the Kennedy competitive streak, was saying something. His racing career began early and achieved genuine distinction. In 1936, when Jack was 19 years old, he won the Nantucket Sound Star Class Championship, defeating some of the best amateur sailors in New England. This wasn't a casual club race. The Star Class was serious competitive sailing, attracting skilled racers from across the region. Kennedy's victory demonstrated real ability, the kind of achievement that couldn't be attributed to family wealth or connections. On the water, money couldn't buy you wind. You either knew how to sail or you didn't, and Jack Kennedy knew how to sail. The boat that would become most associated with Kennedy was the Victura, a 25-foot sloop that the family acquired in 1932. Jack was 15 when the Victura joined the Kennedy fleet, and he sailed her for the rest of his life. The boat became almost an extension of himself. He knew her quirks, her capabilities, how she responded to different conditions. Over decades of sailing, man and boat developed the kind of partnership that serious sailors understand. The Victura was more than transportation or recreation. She was a companion, a refuge, a connection to the happiest parts of Kennedy's life. The name Victura comes from the Latin, meaning about to conquer. Whether the Kennedy family chose this name deliberately as a statement of their competitive philosophy, or whether it was simply the boat's existing name when they purchased her, the symbolism was appropriate. Sailing was conquest of a sort, a battle with the elements, a test of skill and will against wind and water. Kennedy approached it with the same intensity he brought to everything else, the same determination to excel that his family had instilled in him. But sailing also offered something that most Kennedy activities didn't: solitude and tranquility. On a boat, especially when sailing alone, there's a meditative quality to the experience. The constant small adjustments to sails and tiller, the reading of wind and waves, the physical engagement with the boat, all of it requires focus that crowds out other thoughts. Kennedy, whose mind was usually racing with political calculations and policy problems, found on the water a rare opportunity to be fully present, absorbed in the immediate challenge of sailing rather than the endless concerns of his public life. The physical benefits of sailing were also significant for someone with Kennedy's health problems. The ocean air seemed to help his respiratory issues. The motion of the boat, unlike the jarring of land-based activities, didn't aggravate his back. Swimming, which Kennedy often did from the boat, was therapeutic for his spine, providing exercise without the impact that most sports required. Sailing was one of the few athletic activities that Kennedy could enjoy without paying for it in increased pain afterward. During his years in Congress and the Senate, Kennedy would escape to Hyannisport whenever possible, often heading directly to the Victoria for an afternoon on the water. His staff learned to recognize these sailing days as necessary recovery periods, times when their boss would return refreshed and better able to handle the demands of his job. The sailing wasn't self-indulgence, it was maintenance, a way of managing stress and physical limitations that allowed Kennedy to function at the level his ambitions required. The family sailing culture at Hyannisport became famous, partly because of the Kennedys' general fame, and partly because sailing offered such photogenic opportunities. Images of the Kennedy family on boats became iconic. Young, attractive, vigorous Americans enjoying healthy outdoor recreation. These images served Kennedy's political purposes perfectly, projecting exactly the kind of energy and vitality that his actual health problems made precarious. Nobody looking at Jack Kennedy at the helm of a sailboat would guess that he couldn't tie his own shoes some mornings. But the sailing was genuine, not just a photo opportunity. Kennedy really did love being on the water, really did find peace and joy in the simple act of making a sailboat move through wind and waves. This wasn't performance, or at least not only performance. It was a fundamental part of who he was, a passion that predated his political career and would continue until his death. The sea was in his blood, or at least in his psychology, offering something essential that he couldn't find anywhere else. The skills Kennedy developed as a sailor would serve him dramatically during World War II. When his PT-109 was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands, Kennedy's seamanship became a matter of life and death. He led his surviving crew members through hours of swimming to a nearby island, personally towing a badly burned crewmate by clenching the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. The physical endurance this required was remarkable for anyone, but especially for someone with Kennedy's medical history. The back that could barely tolerate daily activities somehow functioned during the hours of desperate swimming that followed the PT-109 disaster. After the war, Kennedy's sailing continued, though his deteriorating back made it increasingly challenging. He had to modify how he sailed, finding positions and techniques that accommodated his limitations. But he never gave it up. The pull of the water was too strong, the peace it provided too valuable. Even as his spine crumbled and his medication list grew longer, Kennedy continued to sail whenever his health and schedule permitted. When Kennedy became president, the Victoria move to Hyannisport's position in his life became more complicated. The demands of the presidency made regular sailing difficult, and the security considerations of protecting a president on open water added layers of complexity that Kennedy found frustrating. But he still got out on the boat when he could, often combining sailing with the family gatherings that took place at the compound. These sailing interludes provided brief escapes from the crushing pressure of the presidency, moments when Kennedy could be just a man on a boat rather than the leader of the free world. The sailing also connected Kennedy to his children. Caroline and John Jr. learned to sail at Hyannisport just as their father had. Teaching them the skills he'd developed decades earlier allowed Kennedy to share something personal, something that mattered to him beyond politics and power. The images of Kennedy sailing with his children are some of the most touching from his presidency. A father sharing his passion with the next generation, creating memories that would outlast his abbreviated life. The Victoria herself became a kind of Kennedy family heirloom. After the president's assassination, the boat remained at Hyannisport, sailed occasionally by other family members but preserved as a connection to Jack. She eventually was donated to the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston, where she's now on permanent display. Visitors can see the boat that carried a future president through the waters of Nantucket Sound, the vessel that provided him with some of his happiest moments and his most peaceful hours. There's something poignant about Kennedy's relationship with sailing and the sea. This was a man who was constantly performing, constantly managing his image, constantly hiding his true physical condition from the world. But on the water, at least some of that pretense could fall away. The sea didn't care about his political ambitions. The wind didn't need to be convinced of his vigor. Sailing allowed Kennedy to be simply himself, without the layers of performance that his public life required. The contrast between Kennedy's sailing life and his political life illuminates something important about his character. In politics, he was calculating, image-conscious, always aware of how his actions would be perceived. On the water, he could let go of that calculation, absorbing himself in the immediate tactile challenge of making a boat move. The same man who carefully stage-managed his public appearances could lose himself in the simple pleasure of a well-executed tack. It was a kind of freedom that his other pursuits rarely provided. Kennedy's love of the sea also connected him to a long tradition of American presidents and leaders who found solace on the water. Franklin Roosevelt, whom the Kennedys knew socially and politically, was also a passionate sailor who found escape from the pressures of leadership on his boats. There's something about the ocean that appeals to people who carry heavy burdens, the vastness of it, perhaps, or the way it puts human concerns in perspective. Against the immensity of the sea, even presidential problems can seem manageable. The sailing culture at Hyannisport was part of a broader Kennedy lifestyle that projected wealth, leisure, and vitality. The family compound, with its multiple houses, the boats, the touch football games, the general atmosphere of energetic privilege, all of it contributed to the Kennedy mystique. But for Jack specifically, the sailing was more than lifestyle. It was therapy, refuge, passion. It was one of the few areas of his life where his damaged body didn't hold him back, where he could compete and excel on equal terms with anyone. As Kennedy's political career advanced, his sailing time inevitably diminished. The demands of campaigning, then governing, left less and less room for afternoon sails on Nantucket Sound. But he never entirely gave it up, never stopped finding moments to get out on the water. Even during the presidency, he would sometimes slip away for a brief sail, chafing at the security boats that now accompanied him, but grateful for even a few minutes of the peace that the sea provided. The sailing represented something Kennedy could never fully have in his public life: simplicity. Politics was endlessly complex, full of competing interests and impossible trade-offs. His health was a constant negotiation of medications and limitations. His family life was complicated by ambition, tragedy, and secrets. But sailing was simple. The wind blew, you trimmed the sails, the boat moved. There was cause and effect you could feel, results you could see immediately. In a life full of uncertainty and complexity, the directness of sailing must have been profoundly appealing. Kennedy's sailing also connected him to New England in ways that were both personal and political. Massachusetts has a deep maritime tradition, and Kennedy's genuine love of the sea helped establish his credentials as a New Englander, despite his family's relatively recent arrival in the region. He wasn't a tourist on the water, he was a real sailor, someone who understood the tides and currents and weather patterns of the New England coast. This authenticity mattered, both personally and politically. The peace Kennedy found on the water was real, but it was always temporary. Eventually he had to return to land, to the demands and deceptions of his public life, to the pain and medication that defined his daily existence. The sea offered escape, not solution. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps those hours of peace, scattered across a lifetime of struggle, helped Kennedy maintain the equilibrium he needed to function. Perhaps the sanctuary of sailing made everything else possible. When Kennedy died in Dallas, he was only 46 years old. He had decades of potential sailing ahead of him, summers at Hyannisport with his children and grandchildren, peaceful afternoons on the water that would never happen. The Victoria sat at her mooring, waiting for a captain who would never return. The sea that had given Kennedy so much peace continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred hundreds of miles away. But the sailing wasn't wasted. Those years on the water, from childhood through the presidency, gave Kennedy something valuable, moments of genuine happiness in a life marked by so much struggle. The sea couldn't cure his illnesses or solve his problems, but it could provide respite, beauty, joy. For a man who spent so much of his life fighting his own body, the freedom of sailing was a gift beyond measure. The love of books and the love of sailing, these two passions reveal dimensions of Kennedy that his political career often obscured. He was more than a politician, more than an image. He was a reader who found wisdom and solace in literature, a sailor who found peace and freedom on the water. These private passions enriched his life, and in ways both direct and indirect made him a better leader. The man who quoted Frost at his inauguration and disappeared onto his sailboat whenever possible was drawing on resources that went deeper than political calculation. Understanding these aspects of Kennedy's life helps us see him as a full human being rather than just a historical figure. He had interests that existed apart from his ambitions, pleasures that weren't calculated for political benefit. The reading and the sailing were authentic expressions of who he was, not performances designed to enhance his image. In a life full of performance and concealment, these genuine passions offer glimpses of the private man behind the public facade. The sickly child who read Byron in bed became the president who quoted poetry in speeches. The teenager who won sailing championships became the man who found sanctuary on the water throughout his life. These threads of continuity connect the young Jack Kennedy to the mature president, showing how early experiences and passions shaped the leader he became. The books and the boats were always there, constant presences in a life that changed dramatically but never entirely left behind its earliest loves. Kennedy's intellectual and nautical pursuits also say something about how he coped with his limitations. Reading allowed his mind to range freely even when his body was confined. Sailing allowed his body to function gracefully even when chronic illness made most physical activities painful. These weren't just hobbies, they were adaptations, ways of finding fulfillment despite the constraints his health imposed. Kennedy couldn't be the athlete his family valued, but he could be a champion sailor. He couldn't always participate in the competitive activities his siblings enjoyed, but he could read more and know more than almost anyone. As we continue exploring Kennedy's private life, keep these passions in mind. They help explain who he was beyond the political persona, a thoughtful, complex man who found meaning in words and waves, who built a rich inner life alongside his public achievements. The books shaped his thinking, the boats shaped his spirit. Together they reveal a Kennedy who was more than his image, deeper than his mythology, more human than his legend often allows. But let's spend a bit more time with the books, because the depth of Kennedy's reading deserves further exploration. His library, both the physical collection and the mental one he accumulated over decades, was genuinely impressive. He didn't just read popular histories or easy biographies. He tackled serious works of political philosophy, economics, and social theory. He read Marx and Mill, Machiavelli and Montesquieu. He wasn't just entertaining himself during those long convalescent hours. He was systematically educating himself in the ideas that had shaped Western civilization. The eclecticism of his reading is notable. Kennedy could discuss ancient history one moment and modern fiction the next. He read the classics of English literature alongside contemporary journalism. He studied military strategy from Caesar to Clausewitz, diplomatic history from the Congress of Vienna to the Treaty of Versailles. This breadth of knowledge gave him unusual intellectual range, the ability to draw connections and see patterns that more specialized minds might miss. His reading also reflected a genuine curiosity about how things worked. Kennedy wasn't content to know that certain policies succeeded or failed. He wanted to understand why. He read about psychology and human motivation, trying to grasp what made people behave the way they did. He studied economics not as abstract theory, but as a tool for understanding the real-world problems he would face as a leader. His intellectual engagement was always practical, always oriented toward application rather than mere knowledge for its own sake. The speed reading course deserves more attention because it represented a characteristic Kennedy approach to self-improvement. He identified a skill that would be useful, the ability to process information quickly, and he systematically developed it. This wasn't casual dabbling, this was focused effort to expand his capabilities. The course itself was intensive, requiring regular practice and the development of new reading techniques. Kennedy stuck with it, practicing until the faster reading rate became natural. The technique he learned involved reducing subvocalization, the inner voice that most people use when reading, and expanding peripheral vision to take in more words at once. These aren't intuitive skills, they require deliberate practice and considerable effort to master. Kennedy's willingness to put in this effort during a period of physical convalescence shows something important about his character. Even when his body was failing, his mind was actively seeking ways to improve and grow. The practical applications of speed reading were immediately apparent in his political career. Senate hearings, committee reports, legislative briefings, all of it involved massive amounts of reading that most politicians barely glanced at before voting. Kennedy actually read the material, absorbing it with his unusual speed and arriving at meetings genuinely informed about the issues under discussion. This gave him advantages that his colleagues, who often relied on staff summaries and bullet points, simply didn't have. During his presidency, the speed reading became even more valuable. The volume of information flowing through the Oval Office is staggering. Intelligence briefings, diplomatic cables, policy papers, news reports, correspondence from every corner of the government. Most presidents develop strategies for filtering this flood, relying on staff to prioritize and summarize. Kennedy did use his staff this way, but he also read far more primary material than most presidents could manage. His speed gave him direct access to information that others received secondhand. The relationship between Kennedy's reading and his speaking is worth examining further. His speeches had a literary quality that distinguished them from typical political rhetoric. The cadences, the imagery, the careful construction of phrases, all of it reflected years of immersion in good prose and poetry. Kennedy knew what made language beautiful because he had read beautiful language. His famous inaugural address, with its ringing declarations and memorable phrases, owes much to his long study of how effective writing works. Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's primary speechwriter, deserves credit for many of the specific phrases and structures in Kennedy's speeches, but Sorensen worked within a framework that Kennedy established, a sensibility about language that came from Kennedy's own reading and aesthetic preferences. The collaboration between them worked because they shared a commitment to eloquence, a belief that political speech could rise above mere communication to become something approaching art. Kennedy's literary interests also shaped his social world in ways that affected his presidency. He cultivated relationships with writers, artists, and intellectuals who might have seemed peripheral to political concerns. But these relationships enriched his thinking, exposed him to perspectives he might not otherwise have encountered, and contributed to the cultural atmosphere of his administration. The famous White House dinners that featured Nobel laureates, poets, and artists weren't just PR. They reflected Kennedy's genuine interest in intellectual life. The poetry specifically offered Kennedy something that prose couldn't quite provide. Poetry operates through compression and suggestion, conveying meaning through rhythm and image as much as through direct statement. Kennedy appreciated this different mode of communication, this way of expressing truths that resist straightforward articulation. The poets he loved, Byron, Frost, and others, were masters of this kind of oblique expression, capturing complex emotional and philosophical territory in compact form. Consider what it meant for Kennedy to memorize poetry, to carry verses in his head that he could summon at appropriate moments. This wasn't showing off, or not only showing off. It was a way of keeping certain ideas and feelings available, ready to inform his thinking or illuminate a situation. The poetry became part of his mental furniture, shaping how he perceived and responded to the world. When he faced difficult decisions, the words of the poets he loved were there in the background, offering perspective and wisdom. Kennedy's relationship with Robert Frost became symbolically important, representing the connection between political power and cultural authority. Frost was by then the grand old man of American poetry, revered for decades of work that had defined American verse for many readers. By inviting him to participate in the inauguration, Kennedy was making a statement about what kind of president he intended to be. One who valued culture, who saw the arts as essential rather than decorative, who believed that a great nation needed great poetry alongside its military might and economic power. The famous moment when Frost couldn't read his prepared poem because of the sun's glare became a metaphor that various commentators interpreted in various ways. What's certain is that Frost's presence at the inauguration elevated the cultural tone of the event, suggesting that Kennedy's administration would be different from the relatively plain-spoken Eisenhower years. Whether Kennedy delivered on this cultural promise is debatable, but the intention was clear and the symbolism powerful. Now, returning to the sailing, there's more to say about how this passion functioned in Kennedy's life. The competitive aspect of his sailing, the championships, the races, satisfied the Kennedy drive for victory that his family had instilled. But there was another dimension to his time on the water that had nothing to do with competition. Sometimes he sailed just to sail, not racing anyone, not trying to prove anything, simply enjoying the experience of being on the ocean. These non-competitive sailing experiences were perhaps the most valuable for Kennedy's psychological health. In a life dominated by competition, with siblings, with political opponents, with his own limitations, the opportunity to simply be, without any need to win or prove anything, must have been precious. The ocean, the wind doesn't declare winners and losers. For someone raised in the Kennedy culture of constant competition, these hours of purposeless sailing offered a radical kind of freedom. The sensory experience of sailing also deserves attention. The wind on your face, the spray of salt water, the sound of waves against the hull, the physical sensation of the boat heeling as it catches the wind. All of this engages the body in ways that most activities don't. For Kennedy, whose body was so often a source of pain and limitation, these pleasurable physical sensations must have been particularly welcome. Sailing gave him positive physical experiences to balance against the constant negative ones his health imposed. The meditation-like quality of sailing is something experienced sailors often describe. The need for constant attention to sails, course, and conditions creates a kind of focused awareness that crowds out other thoughts. This isn't quite meditation in the formal sense, but it produces similar effects, a clearing of mental clutter, a presence in the immediate moment, a respite from the endless churning of plans and worries. Kennedy, whose mind was usually full of political calculations and health concerns, found in sailing a way to quiet the noise. The family dimension of Kennedy's sailing was also important. Hyannisport's summers centered on the water, with various family members sailing, racing, and socializing around the boats. These shared experiences created bonds that went beyond the competitive dynamics of touch football and dinner table debates. On the water, the Kennedys could be a family enjoying themselves together, rather than rivals constantly testing each other. The sailing provided a context for connection that their more competitive activities sometimes undermined. Kennedy's teaching his children to sail represented a particular kind of parental involvement. He was sharing something he loved, passing on skills that had given him joy throughout his life. These weren't political calculations or family obligations. They were genuine moments of father-child connection, made more precious by how rare they were given the demands of Kennedy's career. Caroline and John Jr. learning to sail from their father created memories that would outlast his brief life. The security challenges of a sailing president were considerable. Protecting someone on open water is much harder than protecting them on land. The Secret Service had to develop new protocols for Kennedy's sailing excursions, including escort boats and emergency procedures that must have felt intrusive to a man who valued his time on the water, partly for the solitude it provided. Kennedy reportedly chafed at these restrictions, sometimes trying to evade or minimize the security presence so he could have something closer to the private sailing experience he craved. This tension between security requirements and personal freedom was one of the costs of the presidency that Kennedy found most burdensome. He had accepted that his public life would be constrained in various ways, but losing the freedom of his sailing was a particular sacrifice. The ocean, which had always represented escape and liberty, now came with escort boats and security personnel. The sanctuary was compromised, though not entirely lost. Kennedy's sailing during his presidency took on additional significance as a symbol of his vigor. The images of the president at the helm of a sailboat projected exactly the kind of energy and capability that Kennedy wanted to convey. Here was a leader who wasn't confined to desks and meetings, who could handle the physical demands of sailing, who embodied the active, outdoor life that Americans associated with health and strength. The reality of his physical condition made these images somewhat deceptive, but the sailing itself was genuine, and the skill he displayed was real. The Victura's role in Kennedy's life evolved over the decades. As a teenager, she was a racing boat, a tool for competition. As a young man, she became associated with happier times, with summers at Hyannisport before the war, and the weight of family expectations became so heavy. As president, she represented escape and normalcy, a connection to a simpler time when he could sail without security boats following. The boat accumulated meaning through these associations, becoming more than wood and canvas, becoming a repository of memories and feelings. After the assassination, the Victura became a kind of relic, a physical connection to a president who was rapidly becoming a mythological figure. The family kept her, sailed her occasionally, but increasingly she became an artifact rather than a working boat. Her eventual donation to the Kennedy Library completed this transformation from vessel to memorial, from thing used to thing preserved. She now sits in a climate-controlled display, far from the waters she was built to sail, testimony to a man who found peace on the ocean that he could find nowhere else. The combination of reading and sailing in Kennedy's life represents a balance that he seemed to intuitively seek. Mind and body, intellect and sensation, competition and peace. The books engaged his mind during times when his body couldn't be active. The sailing engaged his body in one of the few physical activities that didn't cause him pain. Together they provided a kind of wholeness that his fragmented health might otherwise have denied him. This balance was part of what made Kennedy compelling to Americans. He wasn't just an intellectual, he could sail a boat and throw a football. He wasn't just an athlete, he could discuss poetry and history. The combination suggested a complete human being, someone whose interests and abilities ranged across the full spectrum of human experience. Whether this image was entirely accurate, and Kennedy's severe health problems suggest it wasn't, the perception of balance contributed to his appeal. Kennedy's reading and sailing also reveal something about how he coped with the stresses and limitations of his life. These weren't just hobbies, they were survival strategies. The reading gave him mental escape and intellectual growth during periods of physical confinement. The sailing gave him physical freedom and sensory pleasure in one of the few athletic contexts his body could handle. Both activities served psychological functions beyond their obvious pleasures, helping Kennedy maintain equilibrium in a life that constantly threatened to overwhelm him. The private Kennedy who read Byron and sailed the Victura is different from the public Kennedy of speeches and press conferences, but these weren't separate people. They were aspects of the same complex individual. The reading informed the speeches. The sailing shaped the vigor he projected. The private pleasures and the public performances were connected, each feeding the other, each contributing to the total picture of who John F. Kennedy was. As we move forward in our exploration of Kennedy's private life, we'll see other dimensions of this complexity: his relationships, his family tragedies, the contradictions between image and reality that defined so much of his existence. But the reading and the sailing remain important touchstones, reminders that there was a genuine person behind the political persona, a man with real passions and pleasures that existed apart from his ambitions. The books and the boats were Kennedy's own, chosen for his own reasons, loved for his own sake. In a life full of performance and calculation, they represented something authentic, the private heart of a very public man. So we've explored Kennedy's health struggles, his intellectual life, his love of the sea. But there's one aspect of his private world we haven't yet touched, the romantic one. And this is where things get complicated, because John F. Kennedy's romantic life was, to put it diplomatically, active. Very active. The kind of active that would get a modern politician trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. But before we dive into the complexities and contradictions of Kennedy's love life, let's start with the woman who would become central to it, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, known to the world as Jackie. The story of how Jack met Jackie has been told so many times that it's taken on the quality of legend, polished smooth by repetition, the rough edges of reality worn away. But the basic facts are these. They met at a dinner party in Washington, D.C. in May of 1952. Jack was 34 years old, a congressman from Massachusetts with his eye on a Senate seat. Jackie was 22, a recent graduate of George Washington University, who was working as an inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald, a job that involved approaching strangers on the street, asking them questions, and photographing their responses. It was charming work for a charming young woman, though it wasn't exactly the career trajectory that her aristocratic upbringing had prepared her for. The dinner party was hosted by Charles Bartlett, a journalist who had been trying to introduce Jack and Jackie for some time. Bartlett thought they'd be a good match, both attractive, both intelligent, both moving in the same social circles of wealthy, politically connected East Coast families. He'd tried to arrange a meeting before, but schedules hadn't aligned. This time, finally, they were both in the same room at the same time, and Bartlett made sure they ended up seated near each other. The attraction was immediate, at least according to most accounts. Jack was, by 1952, a practiced charmer with considerable experience in the art of making women like him. He had the Kennedy looks, the thick hair, the easy smile, the air of confidence that comes from growing up wealthy and being told you're destined for greatness. Jackie, for her part, was strikingly beautiful in an unconventional way, with wide-set eyes, a distinctive voice, and a sophistication that set her apart from the debutantes and socialites who usually circled around eligible young men like Kennedy. What Jackie thought of Jack that first evening has been recorded in her own words, though reported second-hand and filtered through time. She supposedly told a friend that Jack was charming, but that she sensed a kind of detachment in him, an emotional guardedness that made true intimacy difficult. And yet, she was drawn to him anyway, drawn perhaps precisely because he was a challenge. Such heartbreak was worth the pain, she reportedly said, or words to that effect. It was a remarkably prescient observation for a first meeting, suggesting that even then, before she knew the details of his health problems or his other relationships, Jackie sensed that loving Jack Kennedy would not be easy. For his part, Jack was intrigued by Jackie in ways that his previous relationships hadn't quite produced. She was cultured in ways that went beyond mere finishing school polish. She had studied at Vassar and the Sorbonne, spoke fluent French, and had genuine intellectual interests that overlapped with his own. She could discuss literature and art and history with sophistication. She was witty without being cutting, intelligent without being intimidating. And she came from the right kind of family, not Kennedy wealthy, but socially impeccable, the kind of old money background that would complement the Kennedys' newer fortune. But let's pause here and acknowledge the elephant in the room, because any discussion of Kennedy's romantic life has to grapple with it. Jack Kennedy was not, by any reasonable definition, a faithful man. He had relationships with other women before he met Jackie, during their courtship, during their engagement, and throughout their marriage. The evidence for this is overwhelming and has been documented by numerous biographers and historians. Kennedy's infidelity wasn't occasional or discreet, it was habitual, and, within certain circles, well known. He pursued women with the same competitive energy that characterized everything else he did, treating romantic conquest as another arena in which to prove himself. The roots of this behavior are debated. Some point to Joseph Sr.'s example. He was famously unfaithful to Rose Kennedy, carrying on affairs that were open secrets within the family. Jack grew up seeing his father's infidelity as normal, even expected behavior for powerful men. Others point to Kennedy's health problems and his awareness of his own mortality. If you've been told multiple times that you might not live long, perhaps you develop a carpe diem approach to physical pleasure. Still others suggest that Kennedy's compulsive womanizing was a form of emotional avoidance, a way of maintaining the detachment Jackie sensed at their first meeting. Whatever the cause, the behavior was real and had real consequences for those involved. The women Kennedy pursued were many and varied. Socialites, actresses, secretaries, random women who caught his eye. Some of these relationships were brief encounters, others extended over months or years. Some of the women knew they were one of many, others believed themselves special. The ethical dimensions of all this are complicated and have been analysed extensively by biographers with various perspectives. What's certain is that Kennedy's romantic life was far messier than the elegant image of Jack and Jackie that would later become iconic. But back to the courtship. After that first dinner party meeting, Jack and Jackie began seeing each other, though dating in the conventional sense isn't quite the right word. Kennedy was constantly travelling. His campaign for the Senate seat was heating up, and he spent much of 1952 crisscrossing Massachusetts. When he was in Washington, he had congressional duties. The opportunities for traditional courtship activities were limited. Their relationship developed through sporadic meetings, phone calls, and the kind of intermittent contact that characterized the lives of busy, ambitious people. Jackie, for her part, was not simply sitting by the phone waiting for Jack to call. She was living her own life, working at the newspaper, maintaining her own social connections. She was also, unsurprisingly, being pursued by other men. Attractive, intelligent young women in Washington never lacked for suitors. One of these other men was John Husted, a stockbroker from New York whom Jackie actually became engaged to briefly in early 1952, before she met Jack. That engagement was broken off relatively quickly, but its existence suggests that Jackie wasn't pining away for a Kennedy who hadn't yet appeared in her life. The pace of Jack and Jackie's relationship was slow by the standards of the time, when engagements often followed quickly after the start of courtship. They saw each other through 1952 and into 1953, their relationship gradually deepening but not yet formalized. Part of this was practical. Kennedy was focused on winning his Senate race, which he did in November 1952, defeating the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in an upset that announced his arrival as a major political figure. Romance took a backseat to ambition, which would be a recurring theme in their relationship. Kennedy's reputation as a ladies' man was well established by the time he was seriously courting Jackie, and she was certainly aware of it. Washington was a small town in many ways. Gossip travelled quickly, and Kennedy's romantic adventures were hardly secret among the social circles in which they both moved. Whether Jackie knew the full extent of his activities is unclear, but she couldn't have been completely naive about the kind of man she was getting involved with. Her decision to pursue the relationship anyway suggests either remarkable optimism, steely pragmatism, or some combination of the two. The Kennedy family's reaction to Jackie was mixed. Joseph Sr. apparently approved. He saw her as exactly the kind of woman who could complement his son's political career. She was beautiful, well-bred, photogenic, and sophisticated enough to handle the social demands that would come with being a politician's wife. Rose Kennedy was reportedly cooler, perhaps sensing that Jackie came from a world of refinement and culture that made the Kennedys' Irish Catholic striving seem somewhat nouveau riche. The siblings had various reactions, some warmed to Jackie quickly, others found her a bit distant or aloof. Jackie, in turn, had to navigate the overwhelming experience of Kennedy family gatherings. The competitive culture at Hyannisport, the touch football games, the sailing races, the general atmosphere of athletic achievement and verbal sparring was foreign to her background. She was not naturally athletic and found the Kennedy approach to recreation somewhat exhausting. Her tendency toward quiet sophistication didn't always mesh with the Kennedy style of loud, energetic interaction. But she adapted, found her place within the family dynamic, and generally managed to hold her own despite being somewhat outside her comfort zone. The formal engagement came in June 1953, though the announcement was delayed until Jackie returned from a trip to London, where she was covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II for her newspaper. The delay itself tells you something about the relationship. Even a marriage proposal had to be scheduled around other commitments. Kennedy proposed before she left, she accepted, and then she went off to Europe while he continued his senatorial duties. Not exactly the stuff of romantic fairy tales, though it was certainly efficient. During the engagement period, those summer months of 1953 leading up to the September wedding, Kennedy's behaviour did not notably improve. There's evidence that he continued seeing other women even as the wedding plans proceeded, a pattern that would persist throughout the marriage. Whether Jackie knew about this specifically or merely suspected it is hard to determine from the historical record. What's clear is that she went into the marriage with at least some awareness of what she was signing up for. Her early observation about heartbreak being worth the pain suggests she understood that loving Jack Kennedy would involve accepting certain painful realities. The courtship, such as it was, revealed something important about both of them. Jack was capable of genuine connection and clearly valued Jackie in ways he didn't value the parade of other women in his life. But he was also incapable of, or unwilling to commit to, the kind of exclusive devotion that traditional marriage implied. Jackie was intelligent enough to see this and strong enough to accept it, at least initially. Whether this acceptance was romantic pragmatism, self-delusion, or some more complex calculation is something only she could have said, and she never publicly discussed these private matters during her lifetime. Their courtship also took place against the backdrop of Kennedy's health problems, which were serious throughout this period and would become critical shortly after the wedding. Jackie was gradually initiated into the reality of Jack's medical condition, the medications, the back pain, the various treatments that kept him functioning. This was another kind of heartbreak worth the pain. Loving a man whose body was failing him, who might not live to see old age, who required constant medical management just to get through each day. Jackie accepted this too, adding nurse to the roles she would play as Kennedy's wife. The engagement period saw the Kennedy political machine beginning to incorporate Jackie as an asset. Her beauty and style were obvious advantages. She photographed beautifully, presented well in public, and could charm voters and donors with apparent ease. But she also had substantive value, particularly in reaching voters who might be put off by Kennedy's Irish Catholic background. Jackie was Episcopalian by birth, French-speaking, culturally sophisticated in ways that appealed to educated, upper-class voters. She broadened Kennedy's appeal in ways that his family background alone couldn't. By the time summer 1953 turned to fall, everything was in place for what would become one of the most famous weddings of the 20th century. Jackie had accepted Jack with all his complications, the health problems, the other women, the overwhelming family, the political ambitions that would always compete with her for his attention. Jack had found in Jackie a partner who could enhance his public image while tolerating his private failings. It was not perhaps the foundation for a traditional happy marriage, but it was the foundation for something else. A partnership that would captivate America and create one of the most enduring images of glamour and style in American history. On September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island, John Fitzgerald Kennedy married Jacqueline Lee Bouvier in what can only be described as a spectacle. This was not a wedding in the sense that most people understand the word, an intimate celebration of love between two people and their closest friends and family. This was an event, a production, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, power, and political ambition that happened to include a bride and groom somewhere in the proceedings. If you've ever seen pictures of a royal wedding and thought it seemed excessive, the Kennedy-Bouvier wedding would like a word. The venue was St. Mary's Church in Newport, a beautiful Gothic revival structure that had been serving the Catholic community since 1848. The choice of Newport itself was significant. This was Jackie's territory, the summer playground of America's old money aristocracy. The Bouvier and Auchincloss families, Jackie's mother had remarried after divorcing Jackie's father, had deep roots in this world of mansions, yacht clubs, and carefully maintained social distinctions. By holding the wedding in Newport, the ceremony paid tribute to Jackie's background, even as it launched her into the very different world of Kennedy politics. The guest list was staggering. 600 people were invited to the church ceremony itself, enough to fill the pews and overflow into the aisles. But that was just the first wave. The reception afterward, held at Hammersmith Farm, the Auchincloss estate, hosted approximately 900 guests. That's 1,500 people total, which is less a wedding and more a small political rally. You could practically see the voter registration tables in the background. And that was precisely the point, at least from Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s perspective. The father of the groom saw the wedding not primarily as a celebration of his son's marriage, but as an opportunity to advance the family's political interests. Every guest was considered not just for their personal connection to the bride or groom, but for their potential value to Kennedy's political future. Senators, congressmen, businessmen, media figures. The reception looked less like a wedding party and more like a strategic networking event with unusually good catering. Joseph Sr. had been planning for this moment long before Jack met Jackie. His son was a senator now, on track for higher office, and everything in his public life needed to be optimized for maximum political benefit. A wedding was a chance to generate positive press coverage, to showcase the family's Catholicism while also appealing to broader audiences, to create images of youth and vitality that would contrast with the aging Eisenhower administration. The fact that a young couple was getting married was almost incidental to these larger calculations. The scale of the production was remarkable even by the standards of wealthy East Coast families. The flowers alone were a major undertaking. The church was decorated with white chrysanthemums and pink gladioli, while the reception featured elaborate arrangements that transformed Hammersmith Farm into something approaching a botanical garden. The cake was enormous, decorated with intricate sugarwork that must have required days of preparation. The logistics of feeding and entertaining 900 people required military-level planning, which the Kennedy operation provided. The press coverage was extensive and carefully managed. This was before the era of celebrity journalism as we know it today, but the Kennedys understood media manipulation as well as any modern publicity firm. Photographers were given access at strategic moments, ensuring that the images that reached the public were flattering and on message. The young, attractive couple emerging from the church, the glamorous reception, the carefully staged shots of family and guests, all of it was designed to create a narrative of American aristocracy at its finest. Jackie's dress became instantly iconic. Designed by Anne Lowe, an African-American designer who was one of the most sought-after couturiers of her era, the gown featured a portrait neckline, fitted bodice, and a bouffant skirt made from 50 yards of ivory silk taffeta. The dress was elegant rather than ostentatious, sophisticated rather than showy. It reflected Jackie's personal style rather than the more elaborate taste that might have been expected for such a prominent wedding. Anne Lowe incidentally received almost no credit at the time. Her contribution was minimized in the press coverage, a reflection of the racial dynamics of 1950s America. The ceremony itself was performed by Archbishop Richard Cushing of Boston, a longtime Kennedy family friend who would later deliver the invocation at Kennedy's presidential inauguration. Cushing's presence underscored the Catholic dimensions of the event. This was a Roman Catholic wedding in all its traditional formality, complete with a full nuptial mass. For the Kennedy family, publicly affirming their Catholicism was important. They weren't hiding their faith even though anti-Catholic prejudice remained significant in American politics. Bobby Kennedy served as best man, which was the expected choice. He was Jack's closest brother, his most trusted ally within the family, and would later become his attorney general and most important advisor. The wedding party was enormous, reflecting the size of the Kennedy and Bouvier clans and the political dimensions of the event. Every inclusion in the wedding party was considered, every role assigned with an awareness of how it would look in photographs and how it might affect relationships that could matter politically. The weather cooperated, providing the kind of perfect early September day that makes outdoor receptions possible and photographers happy. The reception at Hammersmith Farm spilled across the grounds, with guests mingling on lawns that overlooked Narragansett Bay. The setting was undeniably beautiful. Rolling green hills, sparkling water, the kind of picturesque New England scenery that makes America's old money enclaves so appealing to look at, if not necessarily to live among. The mixture of guests at the reception illustrated the complicated social position the Kennedys occupied. On one hand, there were the old money families from Jackie's world, people whose fortunes dated back generations, who had summer cottages in Newport and winter apartments on Park Avenue, who represented the established American aristocracy. On the other hand, there were the Kennedys' political allies and business associates, a newer, more aggressive crowd who had made their money more recently and weren't always accepted by the old guard. The reception brought these worlds together, sometimes awkwardly, in service of what was ultimately a political project as much as a family celebration. The tension between the two families' styles was evident throughout the proceedings. The Bouvier and Auchinclosses were restrained, dignified, conscious of propriety. The Kennedys were louder, more competitive, more overtly ambitious. Janet Auchincloss, Jackie's mother, reportedly found some of the Kennedy behavior rather too vigorous for her tastes. The touch football game that broke out at the reception, because of course there was a touch football game, probably didn't help matters. This was a Kennedy wedding, which meant that athletic competition was never far away. Jackie's father, John Vanneau Bouvier III, known as Black Jack for his dark complexion and rakish personality, was supposed to walk his daughter down the aisle, but was apparently too inebriated to perform this duty. His role was taken by Hugh Auchincloss, Jackie's stepfather, in what must have been a painful moment for all involved. Black Jack had his own complicated history. He was charming but unreliable, a heavy drinker whose marriage to Jackie's mother had ended in divorce. His absence from the ceremony, while his daughter married into America's most ambitious family, was a sad footnote to the day's celebrations. The cost of the wedding was substantial, though the exact figure has never been definitively established. Various estimates have placed it in the range of what would be millions of dollars today, not surprising given the scale of the event and the wealth of the families involved. The Kennedys and the Auchinclosses split the expenses, though exactly how the division worked has been a matter of some dispute among family historians. What's certain is that no expense was spared in creating the kind of spectacular event that Joseph Kennedy believed his son's political future required. The honeymoon that followed was relatively brief by the standards of wealthy couples of the era. Just a few days in Acapulco, Mexico, before Jack had to return to his senatorial duties. Even the honeymoon wasn't really private. Kennedy spent part of it reading briefing materials and staying in touch with his political operation. The pattern was being established early. Jackie would always be competing with Jack's political career for his attention, and politics would usually win. The immediate aftermath of the wedding saw the couple settling into their life in Washington. They rented a house in Georgetown, the fashionable neighborhood where young political couples were expected to live. Jackie began the process of transforming herself from journalist and socialite into political wife, hosting dinners, managing their social calendar, learning to navigate the particular demands of life as a senator's spouse. It was a significant adjustment, and not all of it was pleasant. The marriage that began with such spectacle would prove to be as complicated as one might expect given everything we've discussed about both parties. Jack continued his patterns of infidelity. Jackie found ways to cope, through her own interests, through her children when they came, through a kind of separate peace that allowed the marriage to function even if it didn't always thrive. But all of that was in the future. On September 12, 1953, there was just a beautiful bride and a handsome groom, a church full of important people, and a reception that launched 1,000 newspaper articles. The wedding established Jackie as a public figure in her own right, not just an appendage to her famous husband. Her style, her elegance, her poise, all of it was on display and all of it was noted. The press coverage portrayed her as the perfect complement to Kennedy's political ambitions. Beautiful, sophisticated, cultured. She was good copy, and she would remain good copy for the rest of her life, long after the marriage had ended in tragedy, and she'd moved on to other chapters of her remarkable story. For the Kennedys, the wedding was a success on every metric that mattered to them. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. The images that emerged were exactly what Joseph Sr. had wanted. A young, attractive, Catholic family that represented the best of American possibility. The political value was immense. The wedding helped establish the Kennedy brand of glamour and vitality that would later be so crucial to Jack's presidential campaign. The religious dimensions of the wedding also served Kennedy's political interests, though perhaps not in ways that were immediately obvious. By having such a prominently Catholic wedding, the Archbishop, the full nuptial mass, the public affirmation of faith, the Kennedys were making a statement about their identity, while also demonstrating that Catholic ceremonies could be elegant, tasteful, and thoroughly American. It was a subtle form of political argument, suggesting that Catholic candidates like Kennedy could be trusted not to impose their faith on the country. The wedding photos became iconic, reproduced endlessly in the years that followed. The young couple cutting the cake, emerging from the church, dancing at the reception. These images became part of the Kennedy mythology, visual evidence of the golden couple that America would later mourn so deeply. Looking at these photos today, knowing everything that would follow, the presidency, the affairs, the assassination, there's a poignancy that the original viewers couldn't have felt. They saw promise. We see the beginning of a tragedy. But on that September day in Newport, tragedy was far away and promise seemed unlimited. John F. Kennedy had married Jacqueline Bouvier, and together they would create one of the most compelling political partnerships in American history. It wasn't a partnership built on conventional marital fidelity, that much was clear from the start. But it was built on something: shared intelligence, mutual respect for each other's abilities, a common project of political ambition that gave the marriage purpose even when love alone might not have been enough. The wedding, and in a way it was, not just for its scale and spectacle, but for what it launched. The couple who married that day would within 7 years be in the White House, transforming American politics and culture in ways that are still felt today. The beautiful bride would become the most famous First Lady in American history, her style and grace setting standards that subsequent political wives would struggle to match. The charming groom would become a martyred president, his abbreviated term forever golden in American memory. All of that started here, on a perfect September day in Newport, when two complicated people from complicated families joined their lives together in a ceremony that was equal parts romantic tradition and political calculation. They were building something, even if neither quite knew what it would become. And the wedding, for all its excess and ambition, was the foundation on which everything that followed would be built. The marriage that began with such fanfare would face challenges that the wedding guests couldn't have imagined. Health crises, personal losses, the pressures of the presidency, and the continuing complications of Kennedy's romantic life would all test the relationship. But Jackie and Jack would find ways to make it work, to present a united front to the public while managing their private difficulties as best they could. The wedding was just the beginning, but what a beginning it was. Newport had seen grand weddings before and would see them again, but there was something about the Kennedy-Bouvier wedding that captured the American imagination in a particular way. Perhaps it was the youth and attractiveness of the couple. Perhaps it was the sense that something important was beginning, that these people were going to matter in ways that extended beyond their personal lives. Perhaps it was simply the scale and confidence of the production, the way it announced that the Kennedys had arrived and intended to stay. Whatever the reason, the wedding of September 12, 1953, became a touchstone in American cultural memory, a reference point for subsequent celebrations, and a symbol of a particular kind of American aspiration. The couple who married that day would help define an era, and the wedding itself would be remembered as the first act of a drama that would captivate the nation. The curtain was rising, the players were taking their positions, and the story of Jack and Jackie Kennedy was about to begin in earnest. But let's go back and fill in some details we've skipped over, because both the courtship and the wedding deserve more attention than we've given them. Jackie's background, for instance, is essential to understanding why she was such a good match for Kennedy, and why the match was also so complicated. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born in 1929 in Southampton, New York, into a world of wealth and privilege that was, in some ways, more established than the Kennedys. Her father, John Vernou Bouvier III, came from a family that had been prominent in American society for generations. Wall Street brokers, lawyers, people whose money was old enough that they didn't have to talk about it. Her mother, Janet Lee, was the daughter of a self-made millionaire, representing the slightly newer money that was always trying to crack into the older elite. The Bouvier household was not happy. Jack Bouvier was charming, handsome, and utterly unreliable, a drinker, a womanizer, a man whose stock market career was marked by more downs than ups. His marriage to Janet deteriorated throughout Jackie's childhood, exposing her to the kind of marital dysfunction that might explain her later tolerance for Jack Kennedy's behaviour. When you grow up watching your father chase other women while your mother grows increasingly bitter and angry, perhaps you develop a certain cynicism about male fidelity, or perhaps you simply learn that some men are like this, and you accept it as part of the package. Jackie's parents divorced in 1940 when she was 11 years old. The divorce was acrimonious and public. Tabloid coverage of the Bouvier split was extensive, giving young Jackie an early education in how the press treated prominent families. She spent her adolescence shuttling between her father in New York and her mother, who had remarried to Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., a wealthy Washington lawyer whose family money came from Standard Oil. The Auchincloss homes, Marywood in Virginia and Hammersmith Farm in Newport, became Jackie's primary residences, though she maintained a close relationship with her father despite his flaws. This background is important because it shaped who Jackie was when she met Jack Kennedy. She was beautiful and cultured, yes, but she was also resilient, having survived a difficult childhood and learned to present a polished exterior regardless of what was happening inside. She understood that wealthy families had secrets, that public images and private realities often diverged dramatically. She had developed the ability to navigate complicated social situations with grace, to charm people while keeping parts of herself hidden. In short, she was perfectly equipped to become a Kennedy. Her education reinforced these qualities. She attended Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, one of the most prestigious girls' boarding schools in the country, where she learned the arts of being a proper young lady while also developing genuine intellectual interests. She went on to Vassar College, then spent her junior year abroad at the Sorbonne in Paris, an experience that shaped her aesthetic sensibilities and gave her the fluency in French that would later be so useful in the White House. She finished her degree at George Washington University after returning from Paris, graduating in 1951. The photography job at the Washington Times-Herald was somewhat unconventional for a young woman of her background. Most of her peers were focused on finding suitable husbands rather than careers, but it suited Jackie's restless intelligence and gave her something to do while waiting for the right opportunity to come along. The job also put her in contact with the political world of Washington, exposing her to the kind of life she would later lead as a political wife. She was gathering skills and experiences that would prove valuable, even if she didn't know it at the time. When she met Jack at that dinner party in May 1952, she was, in some ways, perfectly positioned to appreciate what he offered, and to understand what he was. She had experience with charming, unreliable men. Her father had been one. She had grown up in a world where marriage was often as much about strategic alliance as about love. She knew that the public images of wealthy families bore little relationship to their private realities. Jack Kennedy wasn't a surprise to her in the way he might have been to someone more naive. She recognized the type, even if she couldn't have known all the specifics. The courtship that followed their initial meeting was complicated by Jack's political ambitions, which consumed most of his attention throughout 1952. His campaign for the Senate seat occupied nearly all his time and energy, leaving little room for romance. Jackie later recalled that she barely saw him during this period. He was constantly in Massachusetts, campaigning, while she was in Washington, working. Their relationship progressed through phone calls and occasional meetings when their schedules permitted. This pattern of intermittent contact established something important about their relationship. Jackie was never going to be Jack's primary focus. His ambitions, his career, his health, all of these would always compete with her for his attention, and she would have to find ways to be satisfied with whatever portion of himself he could spare. Some women would have found this intolerable. Jackie apparently accepted it as the price of admission to the life she wanted. The Kennedy family's response to Jackie also deserves more attention. Rose Kennedy's initial coolness toward her future daughter-in-law reflected more than mere snobbery, though there was certainly some of that involved. Rose had spent her life managing the complex Kennedy household, dealing with her husband's infidelities, raising 9 children in an atmosphere of relentless competition. She may have recognized in Jackie a young woman who would face similar challenges and wondered if she had the strength to handle them. Or she may simply have felt threatened by the arrival of another sophisticated woman who might compete for influence over her son. The Kennedy sisters had various reactions to Jackie. Some found her too quiet, too refined, too unwilling to throw herself into the athletic competitions that defined Kennedy gatherings. Others appreciated her style and intelligence, recognizing that she brought something to the family that they lacked. The dynamics were complicated and would remain so throughout the marriage. Jackie was never entirely comfortable in the Kennedy clan, and some of the Kennedys were never entirely comfortable with her. Bobby Kennedy, who had become one of Jackie's closest allies within the family, initially had reservations about the match. He worried that Jackie wasn't tough enough to handle his brother's world, that her refinement might be a liability in the rough and tumble of Kennedy politics. He also perhaps understood his brother's character well enough to wonder if marriage to someone as sensitive as Jackie was wise for either of them. These reservations apparently faded as Bobby got to know Jackie better, but they suggest that even within the family, there were questions about whether this match made sense. Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s enthusiasm for Jackie was largely political. He saw her as an asset, beautiful, well-spoken, from the right kind of family. She could help broaden Jack's appeal beyond the Irish Catholic base that was the Kennedys' core constituency. She photographed well, presented well, and had the kind of sophistication that would play well with educated voters. Whether she would make his son happy was apparently a secondary consideration, if it was a consideration at all. The engagement period, from June to September 1953, saw Jackie beginning her transformation from independent young woman to Kennedy wife. This was not an easy transition. She had to learn the Kennedy way of doing things, the large gatherings, the competitive atmosphere, the constant presence of family and political operatives. She had to accept that her life would now revolve around Jack's career in ways that left little room for her own interests and aspirations. The photography job was left behind. The role of supportive political spouse was taking its place. During these months, Jackie also had to confront the reality of Jack's health problems in ways she hadn't before. She saw him struggling with back pain, observed the medications he took, began to understand the full scope of his physical challenges. This was another dimension of what she was signing up for, not just a husband who might be unfaithful, but one who might be seriously ill, who required careful management of his health just to function. The heartbreak she had intuited at their first meeting was becoming more concrete, more immediate. The wedding planning itself was largely handled by the families, with Jackie having relatively little input into the scale and nature of the event. Joseph Sr. wanted a spectacle. Janet Auchincloss wanted elegance. What Jackie wanted was apparently less important than these competing visions. The final event was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely while managing to be genuinely impressive in its own right. Jackie would later express some ambivalence about her wedding day, suggesting that it had felt more like a production than a personal celebration. The crowds that gathered outside St. Mary's Church on September 12, 1953, were a preview of the public attention that would follow Jack and Jackie for the rest of their lives together. 3,000 people lined the streets hoping to catch a glimpse of the couple, not because Kennedy was president since he was only a junior senator at this point, but because something about this wedding had captured the public imagination. The combination of wealth, youth, beauty, and Catholic ceremony created a spectacle that Americans wanted to see. Archbishop Cushing's performance of the ceremony was itself a significant production. The Catholic Mass was elaborate, filled with ritual and tradition that underscored the religious dimensions of the marriage. For Catholic viewers, the ceremony was a validation. Here was a prominent, wealthy, successful family openly celebrating their faith in the most public way possible. For Protestant viewers, it was perhaps a bit foreign, but also an education in Catholic practice that may have helped soften some of the anti-Catholic prejudice that Kennedy would later confront in his presidential campaign. The reception at Hammersmith Farm was by all accounts a remarkable event. The Auchincloss estate had been transformed for the occasion, its grounds converted into an elaborate party space that could accommodate nearly 1,000 guests. Maya Davis and his orchestra provided music for dancing. Davis was the society bandleader of choice, his presence signalling that this was an event of the highest social caliber. The food was plentiful and elegant, the drinks flowed freely, and the conversation presumably covered everything from politics to society gossip. The gift display alone was reportedly extraordinary. 900 guests meant hundreds of wedding presents, many of them expensive and elaborate. The Kennedys and the Bouvier had wealthy and connected friends, and these friends expressed their affection through silver services, crystal, china, artwork, and all the other material goods that wealthy couples of the era received upon marriage. Managing, displaying, and eventually finding places for all these gifts was a project in itself. The couple's departure from the reception was carefully staged for maximum visual impact. They left Hammersmith Farm amid waves and cheers, heading to the airport for their flight to Acapulco. The honeymoon, though brief, provided the kind of romantic images that the press and public craved. The handsome young senator and his beautiful bride relaxing in a tropical paradise, beginning their lives together in an appropriately glamorous setting. But even on the honeymoon, the patterns of their marriage were being established. Jack reportedly spent portions of the trip reading political materials and staying in touch with his Washington office. The combination of health concerns, his back was always an issue and travel made it worse, and his inability to fully disengage from politics meant that Jackie was sharing her honeymoon not just with her new husband, but with his career and his medical problems. It wasn't exactly the romantic escape that brides traditionally hope for. Returning to Washington, the newlyweds settled into the Georgetown house that would be their first home together. The adjustment to married life was not always smooth. Jackie had to learn to manage a household while also serving as a political wife, hosting dinners, attending events, maintaining the social connections that were essential to Jack's career. She had domestic help, of course. This was not a couple who did their own cooking or cleaning, but the management of it all was her responsibility. The social demands on a senator's wife were considerable. There were dinners to host and dinners to attend, relationships to cultivate, appearances to make. Jackie proved adept at this work, using her charm and sophistication to win friends and influence people on her husband's behalf. But it was work, constant and sometimes exhausting, and it left little room for the intellectual and artistic interests that had defined her before marriage. Jack's health crisis in 1954, the back surgery that nearly killed him, the months of recovery that followed, came less than a year into the marriage. Jackie found herself almost immediately in the role of nurse as well as wife. She stayed by Jack's bedside during his hospitalization, helped manage his care during the long convalescence that followed, and dealt with the emotional and practical challenges of having a seriously ill husband. This was not the life she'd imagined when she accepted his proposal, but she adapted to it, as she would adapt to so many unexpected circumstances in the years ahead. The wedding of September 1953 launched a partnership that would endure until November 1963, when an assassin's bullet ended it. In those 10 years, Jack and Jackie Kennedy would become the most famous couple in America, symbols of youth and vitality and style that captivated the nation and the world. Their wedding was the first act of this remarkable story, the beginning of a journey that would take them from Georgetown to the White House and beyond. Looking back at that September day in Newport, knowing everything that would follow, it's hard not to feel a mixture of emotions. There's the beauty of the event itself, the genuine hope that any wedding represents. But there's also the knowledge of what was to come, the health crises, the infidelities, the assassination, the long years of widowhood that Jackie would spend processing her grief and building a new life. The couple cutting the cake in those famous photographs didn't know any of this. They were simply two young people beginning a life together, full of hope and ambition and complicated love. The wedding of the decade set the stage for the decade that followed. Jack Kennedy would become president in 1960, and Jackie would become the most celebrated First Lady in American history. Their partnership, for all its flaws and complications, would produce moments of genuine beauty and significance. The White House restoration, the cultural events that brought artists and intellectuals to Washington, the grace under pressure that both displayed during the crises that marked the Kennedy presidency, all of it started here on a perfect September day when a charming young senator married a sophisticated young woman and launched a story that America is still telling. The heartbreak that Jackie had predicted at their first meeting would certainly come, in forms she couldn't have imagined and in amounts that would have crushed a weaker person. But there would also be moments of genuine happiness, of connection, of shared purpose that made the pain worthwhile. Whether the bargain was a good one, whether the glamour and the history and the purpose were worth the cost in grief and disappointment, is something only Jackie could have answered, and she kept her own counsel on such matters until the end. What we can say is that the wedding of September 12, 1953, joined two remarkable people in a partnership that would shape American history. Whatever its flaws, and there were many, the Kennedy marriage produced something significant, something that still resonates in our culture decades later. The beautiful bride and the charming groom were building something larger than themselves, even if they couldn't have known it at the time. And the wedding that launched them on this journey was, for all its political calculation and family drama, genuinely significant. The beginning of a story that would captivate America and change it in ways both large and small. The marriage of Jack and Jackie Kennedy, for all its complications and challenges, was supposed to produce children. This was 1950s America, after all, and the purpose of marriage, especially among Catholic families, especially among politically ambitious Catholic families, was the creation of the next generation. The Kennedys were prolific reproducers. Joseph and Rose had produced 9 children, and the expectation was that their offspring would be similarly fruitful. Jack and Jackie began trying to have children almost immediately after their wedding, entering a journey that would bring them moments of profound joy and equally profound heartbreak. The first pregnancy came quickly, but it ended in tragedy. In 1955, just about 2 years after the wedding, Jackie became pregnant. The timing was complicated. This was the period when Jack was recovering from his near-fatal back surgery, when the marriage was still finding its footing, when both of them were adjusting to the realities of their partnership. A pregnancy should have been welcome news, a sign that despite all the difficulties they were building a family. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, somewhere in the first trimester, before the hopes could fully form or the plans could solidify. Miscarriage, then as now, was devastating for the women who experienced it, and often overlooked by everyone else. The culture of the 1950s didn't encourage discussion of such losses. Women were expected to grieve privately, to compose themselves, and to try again. Jackie, who had already been through so much with Jack's health crisis, now had her own medical tragedy to process. And she had to do it largely alone, since Jack was still recovering from his surgery, and the Kennedy family approach to emotional difficulty was generally to push forward rather than to dwell. The second pregnancy in 1956 progressed further but ended even more tragically. Jackie was in her 3rd trimester when she went into premature labour. She was in Newport at the time, staying at the Auchincloss family home, while Jack was in Europe with friends. Not an unusual arrangement for a political couple of that era, but one that would later generate significant controversy. The baby, a girl, was stillborn. Jackie named her Arabella, though some sources suggest the name was chosen retroactively, since the child never lived to be formally christened. The circumstances surrounding Arabella's stillbirth illuminate something important about the Kennedy marriage during this period. Jack was on a yacht in the Mediterranean when the news reached him. He was vacationing with friends, including several women, in the kind of arrangement that would later fuel rumours about his personal conduct. He didn't immediately return when he learned about Jackie's emergency. The delay, how long it was and why it happened, has been the subject of debate among historians, but what's certain is that Jackie endured the loss of her child largely without her husband's immediate presence. This absence during a medical crisis became a flashpoint in their relationship. Jackie was, understandably, devastated, not just by the loss of the baby, but by Jack's apparent inability or unwillingness to be there when she needed him most. Some accounts suggest that she considered leaving him after this episode, that the combination of his continued infidelities and his absence during her crisis pushed her to a breaking point. Whether this was seriously contemplated or merely threatened in the heat of grief and anger, the episode marked a low point in a marriage that had already had its share of difficulties. The baby who never lived, Arabella as she would be remembered, represented the first of what would be several Kennedy children who didn't survive. In a family so focused on legacy, on the future, on building something that would last beyond any individual lifetime, these losses carried particular weight. The Kennedys were supposed to be winners, to succeed at everything they attempted. The death of a child was a failure that no amount of money or connections could prevent, a reminder that some things were beyond even Kennedy control. But life mercifully doesn't consist only of tragedies. On November 27, 1957, just over a year after Arabella's stillbirth, Jackie gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Caroline Bouvier Kennedy, combining both family names in a gesture of unity that acknowledged Jackie's heritage alongside the Kennedy legacy. Caroline was born by caesarean section at New York Hospital, a precaution given Jackie's previous pregnancy difficulties, and she arrived healthy and strong, a living refutation of the fears that had accumulated through years of medical struggle. The arrival of Caroline transformed the Kennedy household. Jack, who had maintained a certain emotional distance in his marriage, and indeed in most of his relationships, proved to be a surprisingly devoted father. He doted on Caroline in ways that surprised people who knew him primarily as the driven, ambitious politician. There was a softness with his daughter that he rarely showed in other contexts, a willingness to be silly and playful and fully present that contrasted with his usual carefully managed public persona. Caroline's childhood would be unusual by any standard. Spent partly in Georgetown, partly at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, and eventually in the White House itself. She was 2 years old when her father launched his presidential campaign, 3 when he was inaugurated, and not quite 6 when he was killed. Her earliest memories would be of a life that was, by any ordinary measure, extraordinary. Secret Service agents, state dinners glimpsed from doorways, a father who was one of the most famous men in the world. But in those early years, before the presidency, Caroline's life was as normal as wealth and political ambition allowed. She had a nursery, a nanny, and parents who, despite their complicated marriage, both clearly loved her. Jackie proved to be a fiercely protective mother, determined to give her daughter as much privacy and normalcy as possible, despite the increasing public attention that came with Jack's rising political profile. The tension between public demands and private family life would define Jackie's approach to motherhood throughout her years as a political wife. Jack's relationship with Caroline also revealed something about how fatherhood was changing in America. The stereotype of the 1950s father, distant, authoritative, leaving childcare to mothers and nannies, didn't quite fit Kennedy's approach. He wanted to be involved with his daughter, wanted to play with her and read to her and be a presence in her daily life. Whether this was natural inclination, a reaction against his own emotionally complicated childhood, or simply love expressing itself in the most obvious way, the result was a father-daughter bond that was genuine and visible. The family expanded again in 1960 when Jackie became pregnant for the 4th time. By this point, Jack was in the midst of his presidential campaign, a grueling, all-consuming effort that left little room for anything else. Jackie campaigned when she could, appearing at events and giving interviews, but her pregnancy limited her participation. She was careful about her health, aware that her previous pregnancy difficulties made this one potentially risky. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., known to the world as John, though the family apparently never called him that, was born on November 25, 1960, just 2.5 weeks after his father won the presidential election. The timing was, in some ways, perfect. The nation had elected a young, vital president, and now that president had a newborn son, the embodiment of the new generation that Kennedy's campaign had promised to represent. The images of the president-elect with his infant son were irresistible, symbols of youth and hope and futurity. John Jr.'s birth was not without complications. Like Caroline, he was delivered by caesarean section, and like his sister, he arrived somewhat early. But he was healthy, and he thrived, quickly becoming part of the Kennedy image that would captivate America. The photographs of the Kennedy family, young, attractive parents with their two beautiful children, became iconic, representing something that Americans wanted to believe about themselves and their country. The White House years brought Caroline and John Jr. into the public eye in ways that no presidential children had experienced before. Television was now the dominant medium of American politics, and the Kennedy children were made for television, photogenic, charming, and utterly appealing. Caroline's third birthday party at the White House was covered by the press. John Jr., toddling around the Oval Office while his father worked, became one of the defining images of the Kennedy presidency. The family dog, Pushinka, a gift from Soviet Premier Khrushchev, the puppy of a famous Soviet space dog, added another layer of charm to the family image. Jackie worked hard to balance the public's appetite for Kennedy family images with her determination to give her children a normal upbringing. She established a small school in the White House so that Caroline could attend classes with other children rather than being isolated. She kept the children out of many public events, insisting on their right to privacy, even as she understood the political value of family photographs. The tension between these impulses, the need for public relations and the desire for private family life, was constant and not always successfully managed. But behind the charming images and the carefully managed public appearances, the Kennedy family continued to experience loss. Jackie suffered another miscarriage in 1961, early in the first year of the presidency. This loss was kept private, hidden from the press and the public, dealt with internally as the Kennedys had always dealt with their difficulties. Jackie grieved, recovered, and continued her public duties, maintaining the facade that the Kennedy family image required. The cycle of pregnancy, hope, and potential loss began again in late 1962, when Jackie became pregnant for what would be the last time. This pregnancy seemed to be progressing well as 1963 began, a year that would bring both unimaginable tragedy and, briefly, tremendous joy to the Kennedy family. Jackie was careful, following her doctor's instructions, trying to avoid the complications that had marked her previous pregnancies. By summer, she was visibly pregnant, and the public began to anticipate the arrival of another Kennedy child. In early August 1963, Jackie was staying at a rented house on Squaw Island near the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port. She was about 5.5 weeks from her due date, far enough along that the baby should survive if born prematurely, but still in a zone where early delivery could be dangerous. On August 7th, she began experiencing distress. Military helicopters rushed her to Otis Air Force Base, where a medical facility had been prepared in anticipation of the birth. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born by emergency caesarean section on August 7th, 1963. He weighed just 4 pounds, 10.5 ounces, small but not impossibly so. The immediate concern was his lungs, which hadn't fully developed. Patrick had hyaline membrane disease, a condition affecting premature infants whose lungs lack the surfactant necessary for proper function. Today this condition is highly treatable, but in 1963 the treatments were limited. Doctors could provide oxygen and supportive care, but there was no way to give Patrick the surfactant his lungs needed. Jack Kennedy rushed to be with his wife and newborn son. Whatever his failings as a husband, whatever the distances that had characterized their marriage, this was a moment when he was fully present. He spent time with Patrick, held him, tried to will him to survive. The entire apparatus of presidential power seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of a 4-pound baby's struggle to breathe. All the Secret Service agents, all the military helicopters, all the resources of the most powerful nation on earth couldn't give Patrick Kennedy what he needed to live. Patrick was transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, where doctors hoped the more advanced facilities might offer some chance of survival. Jack accompanied his son, staying close throughout the ordeal. Jackie, recovering from her caesarean section, couldn't travel. She stayed at Otis, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. The President of the United States sat in a hospital, watching his infant son struggle for breath, utterly powerless to help. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy died on August 9, 1963, 39 hours after his birth. He never left the hospital, never saw the White House, never had a chance to become the person he might have been. Jack was there when he died, having stayed through the night, unwilling to leave his son's side. It was, by all accounts, the most openly emotional anyone had ever seen Jack Kennedy. The man who had maintained composure through the Cuban Missile Crisis broke down at the death of his infant son. The grief that followed Patrick's death was profound for both parents. Jack, who had always maintained emotional control, was visibly shattered. He cried openly at the funeral, a small private service attended only by close family and friends. He had a hard time talking about Patrick in the weeks that followed, struggling with a loss that all his intelligence and charm and political skill couldn't process or fix. For a man who had spent his life winning, who had been trained to believe that determination could overcome any obstacle, the death of his son was a failure that couldn't be rationalized or spun. Jackie's grief was equally deep but expressed differently. She had lost babies before, Arabella, the miscarriages, but Patrick's death was particularly cruel because he had been so close to survival. A few more weeks of gestation and his lungs might have been ready. A few more years of medical advancement and the treatments might have been available. The unfairness of it, the arbitrary cruelty of fate, was hard to accept. Jackie withdrew somewhat after Patrick's death, needing time and space to process a loss that felt almost unbearable. The death of Patrick had an unexpected effect on the Kennedy marriage. It brought Jack and Jackie closer together. The shared grief, the common experience of losing a child, created a bond between them that hadn't existed in quite the same way before. Friends and family noticed a change in how they related to each other, more tender, more attentive, more like partners than they had been in years. The loss of their son became paradoxically a source of renewed connection. In the weeks after Patrick's death, Jack was more openly affectionate with Jackie than he had been throughout their marriage. He held her hand in public, something he rarely did. He seemed more aware of her needs, more present in the marriage. Some historians have speculated that Patrick's death forced Kennedy to confront his own mortality in a new way. Not the abstract mortality of his chronic illnesses, but the concrete reality of death taking someone he loved. Whatever the cause, the change was noticeable. Jackie, for her part, seemed to appreciate this new attentiveness. The marriage that had been strained by Jack's infidelities and emotional distance found, in the aftermath of tragedy, a kind of renewal. They planned a vacation together, a trip to Greece that would allow Jackie to recover, and both of them to grieve away from the public eye. Before that trip, there was another journey planned, to Texas in late November, where Jack would do political work and Jackie would accompany him, showing the unity of the Democratic Party in a state that was crucial for the 1964 election. The trip to Dallas was supposed to be a routine political event, a chance to shore up support in a swing state, an opportunity for Jack and Jackie to campaign together, as they had done so effectively in 1960. Jackie, still recovering from both her cesarean section and her grief over Patrick, was reluctant to go, but she understood the political necessity. She would accompany her husband, smile for the cameras, and then they would take their Greek vacation and try to heal together. We know how that trip ended. On November 22, 1963, less than 4 months after Patrick's death, Jack Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Jackie, sitting beside him in the motorcade, was spattered with his blood and brains, witness to the violent death of her husband in the most public and traumatic way imaginable. The grief she had been processing over Patrick was suddenly overwhelmed by a new, unimaginable loss. Not just her husband, but the father of her children, the man she had loved despite everything, the President of the United States. The connection between these two deaths, Patrick's and Jack's, has been noted by many who have studied the Kennedy story. Jackie later suggested that losing Patrick had somehow prepared her for the larger loss that followed, that the grief she had already been processing made her better able to handle the assassination's aftermath. Whether this is true or simply a way of finding meaning in overwhelming tragedy is impossible to say. What's certain is that the Kennedy family's experience of loss in 1963 was extraordinary, even by the standards of a family that had already known more than its share of tragedy. Caroline and John Jr. were too young to fully understand what happened in Dallas. Caroline was almost 6, John Jr. turned 3 the day of his father's funeral, a heartbreaking coincidence that produced the famous image of him saluting his father's coffin. They lost their father before they could really know him, before they could form the kind of memories that sustain us after death. What they knew of Jack Kennedy would largely come from stories, photographs, and the mythology that grew up around him after his assassination. Jackie's devotion to her children intensified after Jack's death. She became even more protective, even more determined to give them privacy and normalcy despite the overwhelming public interest in the Kennedy family. She moved them out of the White House, away from Washington, eventually settling in New York where they could live something approaching normal lives. She shielded them from the worst of the Kennedy mythology, trying to give them their own identities rather than letting them be defined entirely by their martyred father. The losses that the Kennedy family experienced, Arabella, Patrick, Jack, and later Bobby Kennedy in 1968, created a narrative of tragedy that became central to how Americans understood the family. The Kennedy curse became a phrase, a way of capturing the sense that this family, for all its wealth and privilege, was stalked by death in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Whether this was curse or coincidence or simply the statistical inevitability of tragedy in a large, risk-taking family is a matter of perspective. What's certain is that the Kennedys knew loss in ways that their glamorous image sometimes obscured. For Jackie specifically, the experience of losing children, and then losing her husband just months after losing Patrick, shaped the rest of her life. She remarried to Aristotle Onassis and outlived him too. She watched Caroline and John Jr. grow up, become adults, find their own paths. She lived to see grandchildren, to know that the family would continue despite all the losses. When she died in 1994, she was buried next to Jack at Arlington National Cemetery, together again, finally, after decades apart. John Jr.'s death in 1999 in a plane crash off Martha's Vineyard added another chapter to the Kennedy tragedy. He was 38 years old, handsome and accomplished, carrying his father's name and something of his charisma. His death seemed to confirm, for those who believed in such things, that the Kennedy curse was real, that this family was somehow marked for tragedy in ways that defied rational explanation. But Caroline survived and thrives now in her late 60s, a mother and grandmother herself. She has served as ambassador to Japan and Australia, carrying on the Kennedy tradition of public service in her own way. The family line continues through her children, Jack Kennedy's great-grandchildren, the living legacy of a marriage that began with such hope in 1953 and endured such sorrow in the years that followed. The unspoken grief of the Kennedy family, the losses they processed privately while maintaining their public image, the children who died and the children who survived, the ways that tragedy shaped their relationships and their lives, is an essential part of their story. The glamour and the politics and the scandals get most of the attention, but underneath all of that were parents who lost children, children who lost parents, a family that knew sorrow as intimately as they knew success. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who lived for 39 hours, is buried at Arlington National Cemetery alongside his father, his mother and his sister Arabella, whose remains were moved there after Jack's assassination. The family's together now, the losses finally acknowledged in a way they couldn't always be during their lives. The tiny grave marker for Patrick next to the eternal flame that marks his father's resting place is a reminder that even the most powerful families are vulnerable to the most ordinary tragedies. The Kennedy story is often told as a story of power and glamour, of political triumph and assassination. But it's also a story of family, of parents trying to raise children while managing extraordinary public demands, of losses that couldn't be spun or managed, of grief that had to be carried quietly because the Kennedy image demanded composure. Jack and Jackie Kennedy lost children before they lost each other, and those losses, particularly Patrick's death, so close to the end of Jack's life, shaped who they were and how they related to each other in ways that the political narrative often overlooks. Understanding this dimension of their story, the family tragedies, the unspoken grief, the children who lived and the children who didn't, is essential to understanding Jack and Jackie as people, not just as political figures. They weren't just a president and a first lady. They were parents, dealing with the universal fears and hopes and heartbreaks that parenthood brings. Their losses were their own, private and painful, even as they were forced to process them under the glare of public attention. The babies who didn't survive, Arabella and Patrick and the miscarriages we'll never know about, represent a dimension of the Kennedy story that gets less attention than the politics and the scandals. But for Jack and Jackie, these losses were as real and as significant as anything else in their lives. The children they couldn't save, the family they couldn't build, the hopes that ended in hospital rooms and small grave sites, all of this was part of who they were, shaping their marriage and their lives in ways that only they could fully understand. And the children who did survive, Caroline and John Jr., became the living legacy of a partnership that was complicated and flawed, but also real. Jack Kennedy loved his children, whatever his failures as a husband. Jackie devoted herself to protecting them, to giving them the chance to be their own people, rather than just appendages of the Kennedy myth. The family that emerged from all this tragedy was smaller than they had hoped, marked by losses that never fully healed, but it was real. A mother and two children, carrying forward the memory of a father who died too young, and siblings who never had the chance to grow up at all. Let's return to some details we've passed over too quickly, because the texture of these family experiences deserves fuller exploration. The first miscarriage in 1955 came at a particularly vulnerable moment for both Jack and Jackie. Jack was still recovering from his nearly fatal back surgery. This was the period when he was essentially an invalid, when he wrote Profiles in Courage, when his political career seemed to be on hold while his body tried to heal. Jackie, meanwhile, was adjusting to married life in ways that weren't always easy. The miscarriage compounded an already difficult period. Jackie had to process the loss of a pregnancy while also caring for a husband who was himself seriously ill. The emotional resources she might have drawn on were already depleted. And the Kennedy family culture wasn't one that encouraged dwelling on losses or expressing vulnerability. You were supposed to pick yourself up, move forward, try again. Jackie did all of that, but the loss left its mark. The silence surrounding pregnancy loss in the 1950s is hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Today we have support groups, counseling services, social media communities where people share their experiences of miscarriage and stillbirth. In Jackie's era, these losses were hidden, barely discussed even among close friends. A woman who had a miscarriage was expected to grieve privately and then return to normal life as if nothing had happened. The psychological toll of this enforced silence could be enormous. Jackie's second pregnancy, the one that ended with Arabella's stillbirth in 1956, was even more devastating because it had progressed so much further. By the third trimester, expectant parents have typically begun to visualize their child, to plan for the future, to allow themselves to hope. The nursery is prepared. The name is chosen. The reality of the coming baby has become concrete. To lose a pregnancy at this stage is to lose not just a potential child, but a fully imagined future. A specific person you've already begun to know. The circumstances of Arabella's stillbirth, Jack's absence, his delay in returning, became a turning point in the marriage. Different biographers have told this story differently, but the basic facts are not in dispute. Jackie went into premature labour while Jack was on a vacation in Europe, and he did not immediately rush to her side. The reasons for his delay have been variously explained. Communication difficulties, travel logistics, perhaps a reluctance to face a crisis he couldn't control. Whatever the reason, Jackie experienced the most traumatic event of her life largely without her husband's support. The emotional aftermath of this episode was severe. Jackie, by some accounts, seriously considered ending the marriage. She had endured Jack's infidelities, his emotional distance, his constant prioritization of politics over their relationship. But his absence during her medical crisis was a betrayal of a different order. This wasn't just about other women or career ambition. This was about basic decency, about being there when your wife needed you. That he failed this fundamental test raised questions about whether the marriage could survive. Joseph Kennedy Sr., according to some accounts, intervened to save the marriage. He reportedly offered Jackie a financial settlement, a significant amount of money, if she would stay with Jack and maintain the public image of a happy marriage. Whether this story is entirely accurate or whether it exaggerates what was actually a more subtle negotiation, it reflects the transactional nature of political marriages in this era. Staying together wasn't just about love or commitment. It was about mutual advantage, about the careful calculation of what each party gained from the arrangement. Jackie stayed. She stayed through the grief over Arabella, through Jack's continued infidelities, through the mounting pressures of his political career. Whatever her reasons, love, ambition, financial security, a belief that things would get better, she made the choice to remain in a marriage that had already caused her significant pain. And in time, that choice would lead to Caroline, to John Jr., to the White House, to a place in history that a divorce would have foreclosed. Caroline's birth in November 1957 represented a kind of triumph over all the preceding losses. After the miscarriage, after Arabella, after all the heartbreak and medical complications, here was a healthy baby, alive and crying, full of the promise that her siblings had been denied. The relief that Jack and Jackie must have felt is hard to overstate. Every pregnancy after loss is shadowed by fear, by the knowledge that things can go wrong, by the memories of what has already been lost. Caroline's successful arrival allowed them to finally exhale, to believe that parenthood might be possible after all. The transformation in Jack that Caroline's birth occasioned surprised many who knew him. He had never been particularly comfortable with children. The Kennedy competitive environment wasn't designed to produce nurturing personalities, and his emotional reserve made intimacy of any kind difficult for him. But with Caroline, something shifted. He became playful, affectionate, genuinely engaged in ways that seemed to contradict his usual persona. Some of this was simply the effect that children have on many parents. The helplessness of an infant, the unconditional love they offer, the way they force you out of your own concerns and into the immediate demands of caring for another person. These experiences can transform even the most guarded personalities. Jack Kennedy, who had spent his entire life managing his image and pursuing his ambitions, found in Caroline something that didn't require management or pursuit. She was just there, needing him, loving him, giving him a relationship uncomplicated by the calculations that characterized so much of his life. The political dimension of Caroline's birth was also significant. Kennedy was already being discussed as a potential presidential candidate, and having a photogenic young family was an obvious political asset. The images of Jack with his infant daughter played well in the press, projecting warmth and humanity that balanced his sometimes cool intellectual image. Caroline became part of the Kennedy brand almost from birth, her existence serving political purposes even as it brought genuine joy to her parents. Jackie's approach to motherhood was intense and protective. She had seen how the Kennedy family operated, the relentless competition, the pressure to perform, the subordination of individual needs to family ambition, and she was determined to give Caroline something different. She wanted her daughter to have a childhood, to be allowed to develop at her own pace without the crushing expectations that had shaped the Kennedy children. This protective instinct would intensify as Caroline grew and as the family's public profile increased. The contrast between how Jackie and the Kennedy family viewed child-rearing was a source of ongoing tension. The Kennedys believed in throwing children into the competitive fray early, in toughening them up through athletic competition and intellectual challenge. Jackie believed in gentleness, in allowing children to be children, in protecting them from the harsher aspects of the adult world. These philosophies weren't entirely compatible, and navigating them required constant negotiation. When Jackie became pregnant again in late 1959, the political stakes were even higher than they had been with Caroline. Jack was now actively running for president, and the campaign was entering its most intense phase. A pregnant candidate's wife was an asset. It projected family values, youth, vitality. But it also meant that Jackie couldn't campaign as actively as she might otherwise have done. She made appearances when she could, but as the pregnancy progressed, she had to limit her involvement. John Jr.'s birth on November 25, 1960, just over 2 weeks after his father won the presidential election, was perfectly timed for maximum symbolic impact. The president-elect now had a son, an heir, a continuation of the Kennedy line into the next generation. The photographs of Jack with his newborn boy became instant classics, images of hope and futurity that seemed to embody everything the Kennedy campaign had promised. America had elected a young president, and now that president had given them the most powerful symbol of youth possible, a new baby. The early weeks of John Jr.'s life coincided with the transition period between election and inauguration, a time of intense activity for the Kennedy operation. Jack was assembling his cabinet, meeting with outgoing President Eisenhower, preparing for the enormous responsibilities that would descend on January 20th. Jackie was recovering from another cesarean section, while also trying to be present for her newborn son and her 3-year-old daughter. The demands were overwhelming even with all the help that wealth and position could provide. The White House years that followed brought unprecedented scrutiny to the Kennedy children. Caroline and John Jr. were the first young children in the White House since the Theodore Roosevelt administration, and the public's interest in them was intense. Photographers wanted pictures. Journalists wanted stories. The American people, enamored with the young, beautiful Kennedy family, couldn't get enough of the presidential children. Jackie's response was to try to establish boundaries, while also understanding the political necessity of occasional public exposure. She allowed some photographs, some access, while fiercely protecting the children's daily lives from media intrusion. The small school she established in the White House allowed Caroline to attend classes with other children while still maintaining security. The careful management of public appearances gave the press enough to satisfy their appetite, without exposing the children to constant scrutiny. The children's lives in the White House were, within the constraints of presidential security, surprisingly normal in some ways. They had pets, not just Pushinka, the Soviet space dog's puppy, but also ponies, birds, and a rotating menagerie that delighted the children and exasperated the staff. They played on the White House grounds, supervised by nannies and Secret Service agents. They had birthday parties and play dates and all the ordinary experiences of childhood, overlaid with the extraordinary reality of living in the most famous house in America. Jack's relationship with his children during the White House years was constrained by the demands of the presidency, but remained genuinely warm. He made time for them when he could, playing with them in the Oval Office, reading to them at bedtime, incorporating them into his daily routine in ways that previous presidents had rarely managed. The famous photographs of John Jr., playing under the resolute desk while his father worked, capture something real, a father who wanted his children near him, even during the crushing demands of the presidency. The miscarriage Jackie suffered in 1961, early in the first year of the Kennedy presidency, was kept private. The press wasn't told, the public didn't know. This was another loss to add to Arabella and the 1955 miscarriage. Another reminder that Jackie's body struggled with pregnancy in ways that all her privilege couldn't overcome. She grieved privately, continued her public duties, and eventually became pregnant again in late 1962. This final pregnancy, the one that would result in Patrick, was anticipated with particular intensity because of all that had come before. The previous losses, the medical complications, the difficulty Jackie had carrying pregnancies to term, all of it made this pregnancy feel precarious from the start. Jackie was careful, following medical advice, trying to give this baby the best possible chance. The summer of 1963 saw Jackie in the late stages of pregnancy, spending time at the Kennedy compound and trying to rest before the baby's arrival. Jack was consumed with presidential business. There was always a crisis demanding attention, always another political challenge to navigate. But there were also moments of family time, of quiet days by the ocean, of the kind of normalcy that the presidency rarely allowed. Patrick's premature arrival on August 7, 1963, triggered a medical emergency that brought the limitations of 1960s medicine into stark relief. Hyaline membrane disease, the condition that killed Patrick, is today highly treatable. Synthetic surfactant can be administered directly into premature infants' lungs, allowing them to breathe until their own bodies can produce the necessary compounds. But in 1963, this treatment didn't exist. Doctors could only provide oxygen and hope that Patrick's immature lungs would somehow manage. The 39 hours of Patrick's life were agonizing for his parents. Jack, who had faced so many crises with apparent calm, was undone by this one. He couldn't control it, couldn't manage it, couldn't find a solution through intelligence or connections or force of will. His infant son was dying, and there was nothing he could do but be present and hope. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, was utterly helpless. Jackie, recovering from her cesarean section at Otis Air Force Base, couldn't be with Patrick during his final hours. She had to wait, receiving updates by phone, imagining what was happening in the Boston hospital where her son was struggling to breathe. The helplessness of being separated from her dying child must have been excruciating. She had carried this baby, hoped for him, imagined his future, and now he was slipping away in a hospital she couldn't reach. Patrick's death, when it came in the early morning hours of August 9th, was gentle, if any death can be called gentle. He simply stopped breathing, his immature lungs finally giving out after 39 hours of struggle. Jack was there, having stayed through the night, unwilling to leave his son's side. When it was over, he reportedly held Patrick and wept, the emotional control that had served him through so many public crises finally breaking down. The funeral for Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was small and private, held at the Cardinal's Chapel in Boston. Only close family and a few friends attended. The tiny white casket, so small that it could be carried by one person, was a heartbreaking reminder of how brief Patrick's life had been. Jack wept openly at the funeral, something that shocked people who had never seen him display such emotion. The president, who had maintained composure during the Cuban Missile Crisis, couldn't maintain it for the burial of his son. In the weeks that followed Patrick's death, Jack and Jackie drew closer together than they had been in years, perhaps ever. The shared grief, the common experience of losing a child, created a bond that transcended the complications of their marriage. Friends noticed that Jack was more attentive to Jackie, more openly affectionate, more present in the marriage. The death of their son had, paradoxically, given them something they had been missing: genuine intimacy based on shared vulnerability. The Greek vacation they planned was meant to be part of their healing process. Jackie would sail the Mediterranean with her sister Lee Radziwill and Aristotle Onassis, a trip that would later fuel rumours about the nature of Jackie's relationship with the Greek shipping magnate. Jack supported the trip, understanding that Jackie needed time away from the pressures of Washington and the memories of Patrick's death. He would join her briefly during the trip, but the vacation was primarily for her recovery. Before Greece, however, there was Texas. The political trip that Jack and Jackie took to Dallas in November 1963 was supposed to be a routine campaign event. important for 1964 strategy, but not particularly significant in itself. Jackie, still recovering from both her caesarean section and her grief over Patrick, was reluctant to go. But she understood the political necessity, and she wanted to support her husband. The renewed closeness they had found after Patrick's death made her more willing to be present for him. The connection between Patrick's death and Jack's assassination, occurring within 4 months of each other, has been the subject of much reflection. Some have seen it as evidence of the Kennedy curse, the sense that this family was marked for tragedy in ways that defied ordinary probability. Others have noted the way that the grief over Patrick seemed to prepare both Jack and Jackie for something worse, as if the earlier loss had been practice for the ultimate one. Jackie herself later suggested that losing Patrick had somehow made her better able to handle November 27th. The grief she was already carrying, the processing she had already begun, gave her a framework for the catastrophic loss that followed. Whether this is true or simply a way of finding meaning in overwhelming tragedy, it reflects the reality that grief is cumulative. Each loss builds on and is shaped by the losses that came before. The Kennedy children who survived, Caroline and John Jr., lived the rest of their lives in the shadow of their father's assassination and their brother's brief existence. Caroline, who was almost 6 when her father died, has memories of him, though how clear or accurate those memories are after decades of mythologizing is hard to say. John Jr., who was 3, had no real memories of his father, only the stories, the photographs, the eternal flame at Arlington that he would visit throughout his childhood. Jackie's devotion to protecting her children from the excesses of Kennedy mythology was fierce and unrelenting. She wanted them to have their own identities, to be Caroline and John rather than just President Kennedy's children. She gave them as much privacy as was possible for people of their prominence, shielding them from the press, sending them to schools where they could be relatively normal, insisting that they be allowed to make their own choices rather than being conscripted into the Kennedy political project. The grief that Jackie carried for Arabella, for Patrick, for Jack was largely private. She rarely spoke publicly about her losses, maintaining the composure that her background and her position demanded. But those who knew her well understood that the losses never fully healed, that she carried her dead children and her murdered husband with her throughout the rest of her life. The public saw the elegant former First Lady. Close friends saw a woman who had survived tragedies that would have destroyed most people. The family plot at Arlington National Cemetery, where Jack, Jackie, Arabella and Patrick are now buried together, represents a kind of reunion that was impossible in life. The tiny graves of the children who didn't survive, Arabella on one side, Patrick on the other, flank their parents' resting place. The family finally complete in a way it never was during life. The eternal flame burns above Jack's grave, but the small markers for his children are equally part of the memorial, acknowledging losses that were too often overlooked in the mythology of Camelot. The Kennedy family's experience of loss reminds us that tragedy is democratic. It strikes the powerful and the ordinary alike, respecting neither wealth nor position nor political achievement. Jack and Jackie Kennedy had everything that money and ambition could provide, but they couldn't protect their children from the randomness of premature birth or the violence of assassination. Their losses were their own, private and painful, even as they were forced to process them under the scrutiny of public attention. For those of us looking back at the Kennedy story, the family tragedies add a dimension of humanity that the political narrative sometimes obscures. These weren't just historical figures. They were parents who lost children, who grieved, who struggled to make sense of losses that defied meaning. The unspoken grief they carried, the children who died, the husband who was murdered, the family that was devastated by violence and chance, is as much a part of their story as the glamour and the politics and the legend. Understanding this aspect of the Kennedy experience helps us see them as fully human, rather than as the mythological figures they sometimes become in our collective memory. They suffered. They grieved. They carried on despite losses that would have broken many people. And in that carrying on, in that determination to continue living even after devastating loss, they showed a kind of resilience that is perhaps more admirable than any political achievement. The family tragedies and unspoken grief of the Kennedy years are the foundation on which everything else rests. The glamour of the White House, the achievements of the presidency, the legacy that continues to shape American politics, all of it was built by people who were carrying grief that the public rarely saw. Jack and Jackie Kennedy were not just a president and a first lady. They were bereaved parents, survivors of losses that shaped who they were and how they loved and what they hoped for. The children they lost, Arabella, Patrick, and in a sense Jack himself, are as much a part of their story as the children who survived. We've touched on the difficulties in Jack and Jackie Kennedy's marriage throughout this story, the infidelities, the emotional distance, the competing demands of politics and family. But to really understand the Kennedy partnership, we need to examine it more closely, because it was neither the fairy tale that the public relations machine suggested, nor the disaster that some later accounts have portrayed. It was, like most marriages, complicated, a mixture of genuine affection, mutual respect, profound disappointment, and practical accommodation that evolved over the decade they were together. The rumours about Jack's infidelities weren't rumours at all, really. They were facts, documented by multiple sources, acknowledged by people close to the Kennedys, and confirmed by historical research in the decades since his death. Kennedy was unfaithful to Jackie from the beginning of their marriage, during their engagement actually, if we're being precise about timelines. His affairs weren't occasional lapses or moments of weakness. They were a consistent pattern of behaviour that continued throughout their time together, including during his presidency. The list of women associated with Kennedy is extensive and varied. There were socialites and actresses, secretaries and interns, famous women and anonymous ones. Some affairs were extended relationships, others were brief encounters. Some of the women knew about each other, most probably didn't know the full scope of Kennedy's activities. The Secret Service, tasked with protecting the president, found themselves in the awkward position of also facilitating his romantic adventures, or at least looking the other way while they occurred. The most famous of Kennedy's rumoured affairs was with Marilyn Monroe, the iconic actress whose breathy "Happy Birthday, Mr." President performance at Madison Square Garden in May 1962 remains one of the most analysed moments in American pop culture. Whether Kennedy and Monroe actually had a physical relationship, and if so, how extensive it was, remains a matter of historical debate. What's certain is that they knew each other, that there was at least flirtation, and that Monroe's mental health struggles and eventual death added a tragic dimension to whatever connection they had. But Monroe was just the most famous name on a long list. There was Judith Campbell Exner, who claimed to have had an affair with Kennedy while also being involved with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, a connection that raised serious questions about national security. There were various White House staff members, including interns who were apparently brought in partly for the purpose of being available to the president. There were women Kennedy met on the campaign trail at social events through mutual friends. The sheer volume of his romantic activity suggests something compulsive, something that went beyond ordinary infidelity into a pattern that had its own pathological logic. Why did Kennedy behave this way? The psychological explanations are various and none of them fully satisfying. His father's example certainly played a role. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was notoriously unfaithful to Rose, and Jack grew up seeing this as normal behaviour for powerful men. The Kennedy culture of competition and conquest may have extended to women, making romantic success another arena for proving oneself. Kennedy's health problems and his awareness of his own mortality may have created a live-for-today mentality that justified present pleasure over long-term consequences. His emotional guardedness, his difficulty with genuine intimacy, may have made serial, shallow relationships easier than one deep one. Jackie's knowledge of and response to Jack's behaviour evolved over time. In the early years of their marriage, she seems to have hoped that things would change, that once they were married, once they had children, once he achieved his political goals, he would settle down and be faithful. This hope proved unfounded. As the evidence of his continuing infidelities accumulated, Jackie had to develop strategies for coping with a reality that wasn't going to change. One strategy was simply to look away, to not see what was happening or to pretend not to see it. This required a kind of willful blindness that must have been psychologically exhausting, but it allowed Jackie to maintain the public image of a happy marriage while privately knowing that image was false. She focused on other aspects of her life, her children, her cultural interests, her role as First Lady, and tried not to dwell on what her husband was doing when she wasn't around. Another strategy was to find her own sources of fulfillment outside the marriage. Jackie had her own friends, her own interests, her own social life that didn't revolve entirely around Jack. She travelled, she pursued her passion for art and culture, she cultivated relationships that provided the emotional connection her marriage sometimes lacked. Whether any of these relationships crossed the line into her own infidelity is a matter of speculation. There have been rumours about Jackie and various men, but nothing as well documented as Jack's affairs. The practical accommodations within the Kennedy marriage were extensive. They maintained separate bedrooms, not unusual for wealthy couples of that era, but still significant. Their schedules often diverged, with Jackie spending time at the family compounds or travelling while Jack was absorbed in political work. They had developed ways of being married that didn't require constant togetherness, which suited both Jack's need for freedom and Jackie's need for space from his behaviour. But here's the thing that makes the Kennedy marriage more complicated than a simple narrative of betrayal and accommodation. There was also genuine affection between them. Jack respected Jackie's intelligence and valued her opinions in ways he didn't always value the opinions of the parade of other women in his life. He was proud of her accomplishments as First Lady, impressed by her cultural achievements, genuinely pleased by the positive attention she brought to his administration. And Jackie, for all her disappointments, seemed to genuinely love Jack. Not blindly, not naively, but with clear eyes about who he was. Their correspondence, when they were apart, reveals a warmth that the stories of infidelity might seem to contradict. Jackie wrote Jack notes about his health, reminding him to take care of himself, providing instructions for his diet and his medications. Nothing fried, one such note reportedly said. A simple instruction that reveals the daily care Jackie took for Jack's well-being despite everything else. She knew his health was fragile, knew the medications he took and the restrictions he needed to follow, and she tried to help him manage these challenges even when she was frustrated by his other behaviour. Jack, for his part, wrote Jackie letters that expressed real affection, complimenting her work, expressing pride in her achievements, noting how much he missed her when they were apart. Were these expressions genuine, or were they the practiced charm of a politician who knew how to say what people wanted to hear? Probably both to some extent. Kennedy was capable of genuine feeling, but he was also incapable of letting that feeling limit his behaviour in the ways that conventional morality would require. The marriage functioned in some ways as a partnership more than a romance. Jack and Jackie were building something together, his political career, their family, their place in American history. They were a team, even when they weren't faithful partners. Jackie contributed to Jack's success in ways that went beyond producing attractive family photographs. She gave him access to cultural and intellectual circles that he couldn't have reached on his own. She softened his image, adding grace and sophistication to his political brand. She was an asset, and he knew it and valued it. Jackie's value as a political partner was demonstrated dramatically during the 1960 campaign. Her elegance, her language skills, her ability to connect with voters in ways that Jack's Irish Catholic background couldn't. All of this contributed to his narrow victory. She campaigned effectively when she could, her pregnancy with John Jr., limited her participation, gave interviews that charmed the press, and projected an image of the Kennedy family that appealed to voters across demographic lines. Her contribution to Jack's political success was real and substantial. The White House years intensified both the strengths and the strains of the Kennedy marriage. On one hand, they were working together on a project of genuine importance, leading the nation, managing crises, presenting America to the world. Their shared sense of purpose gave the marriage a meaning that transcended its personal difficulties. On the other hand, the pressures of the presidency created opportunities for Jack's behaviour to continue and even expand. The power and glamour of the White House attracted women, and Jack's position made his activities harder to question or constrain. Jackie's response to the White House environment was to carve out spaces that were her own. Her restoration of the White House, her cultural programming, her careful management of the family's public image, all of these were domains where she had control, where her taste and judgment were respected, where she could achieve something meaningful, independent of her husband's behaviour. The White House became, in a sense, Jackie's project as much as Jack's presidency was his. The dynamic between them during the presidency was observed by many and interpreted variously. Some saw, others saw. The truth was probably both. A marriage that was complicated enough to contain real love alongside real betrayal, genuine partnership alongside profound disappointment. The death of Patrick in August 1963 created a shift in the marriage that many observers noted. The shared grief, the common experience of losing a child, broke through some of the barriers that had accumulated over years of hurt and accommodation. Jack was more attentive to Jackie after Patrick's death, more openly affectionate, more present in the marriage. Jackie, in turn, seemed to allow this renewed closeness, perhaps recognizing that grief had opened something in Jack that other experiences hadn't. In the weeks between Patrick's death and Jack's assassination, the Kennedys were, by most accounts, closer than they had been in years. Jack held Jackie's hand in public, a rare display of physical affection for them. He was solicitous of her well-being, aware that she was still recovering from the cesarean section and the emotional trauma of losing Patrick. They planned their Greek vacation together, looking forward to time away from the pressures of Washington. Something had changed, opened, softened. Whether this renewed closeness would have lasted is impossible to know. The assassination ended the marriage before this new chapter could fully develop. We can't know if Jack would have maintained his new attentiveness, or if old patterns would have reasserted themselves. We can't know if Jackie would have continued to accept this version of her husband, or if she would have eventually demanded more. The story was cut short, leaving us to wonder what might have been if they had been given more time. The Kennedy marriage ultimately defies simple characterization. It was not a love story in the conventional sense. There was too much betrayal for that. But it was not merely a political arrangement either. There was too much genuine feeling for that. It was something more complicated, a partnership between two extraordinary people who brought out both the best and the worst in each other, who caused each other pain but also gave each other things they couldn't have found elsewhere. Jackie's devotion to Jack's memory after his death suggests that whatever her disappointments during the marriage, she valued what they had built together. She protected his legacy fiercely, shaped the narrative of Camelot that would define how Americans remembered the Kennedy presidency, and ensured that his achievements were celebrated while his failures were minimized. This protective impulse went beyond mere widow's loyalty. It reflected a genuine commitment to the partnership they had created, even acknowledging its flaws. The complexity of the Kennedy marriage is in some ways the most human thing about them. They weren't the perfect couple of the publicity photos, but they weren't the damaged disaster of the exposés either. They were two flawed people who made a life together, who found ways to make their partnership work despite significant obstacles, who loved each other in ways that were real even if they were also insufficient. Their marriage was a negotiation, an accommodation, a work in progress that was still evolving when it was violently ended. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding both Jack and Jackie as people, rather than as symbols. The image of Camelot, the perfect couple, the beautiful family, the lost golden age, is powerful but incomplete. The reality was messier, harder, more human. And in that messiness, that humanity, the Kennedy marriage becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a reflection of the challenges that many couples face, magnified by extraordinary circumstances and played out on the world's largest stage. If the Kennedy marriage was complicated in its private dimensions, its public expression through cultural programming was remarkably coherent and influential. Jackie Kennedy transformed the White House into a center of American arts and culture in ways that no First Lady before her had attempted, and few since have matched. This wasn't just decoration or entertainment, it was a statement about what America could be, about the place of beauty and intellect in national life, about the values that should guide the most powerful nation on earth. The White House that Jackie inherited in January 1961 was, by her standards, something of a disappointment. Decades of neglect and mismatched renovations had left the interior a hodgepodge of styles, with reproduction furniture, uninspired decorations, and a general atmosphere that Jackie found depressingly institutional. This was the People's House, the symbol of American democracy, and it looked like a mid-range hotel that had let its maintenance budget lapse. Not exactly the impression you want to make on visiting heads of state. Jackie's restoration of the White House became her signature project as First Lady. She established a fine arts committee to oversee the acquisition of historical furniture and artwork. She brought in experts to research the mansion's history and identify period-appropriate furnishings. She solicited donations from wealthy Americans willing to contribute antiques and paintings that could restore the White House to something approaching its historical grandeur. The project was enormous in scope, involving virtually every public room in the mansion. The restoration wasn't just about aesthetics, though the aesthetic improvements were significant. It was about creating a sense of history, of continuity, of America as a nation with a past worth honoring. Jackie wanted visitors to the White House to feel the weight of history, to understand that they were walking through rooms where Lincoln and Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt had worked and lived. The cheap reproductions and institutional furniture had erased that sense of connection. The restoration brought it back. The television tour that Jackie gave of the restored White House in February 1962 was a sensation. Over 80 million Americans watched as the First Lady walked through room after room, explaining the history of each space and the significance of the furnishings she'd gathered. Her soft voice, her obvious knowledge and passion, her elegant presence, all of it captivated viewers and established Jackie as a cultural figure in her own right, not merely an appendage to her presidential husband. The broadcast won an Emmy Award and cemented Jackie's reputation as the most influential First Lady in modern American history. But the restoration was only part of Jackie's cultural project. She also transformed the White House into a venue for artistic and intellectual events that had no precedent in presidential history. Previous First Ladies had hosted social occasions, certainly, dinners and receptions and the standard entertainments of political life. But Jackie's vision was different. She wanted the White House to be a place where American culture was celebrated and elevated, where artists and intellectuals felt welcomed and honored. The dinner honoring Nobel Prize laureates in April 1962 became a landmark event in this cultural project. The guest list included nearly all living American Nobel winners, scientists, writers, economists, along with other distinguished intellectuals and artists. President Kennedy, addressing this extraordinary gathering, quipped that this was probably the most concentration of genius in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. The joke captured something real. The Kennedys were signaling that intellectual achievement mattered, that America valued brains as much as brawn, that the presidency could be a platform for celebrating the life of the mind. The Nobel dinner was just one of many cultural events that Jackie orchestrated. There were performances by world-class musicians. Pablo Casals, the legendary cellist, performed at the White House in November 1961, his first appearance there since he had played for Theodore Roosevelt. The Casals concert was a statement in itself. This was one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, a man who had refused to perform in countries that recognized Franco's Spain, choosing to honor the Kennedy White House with his art. The concert attracted international attention and established that the Kennedy White House would be a venue for serious culture. Other performances followed: the Metropolitan Opera, the American Ballet Theatre, Shakespeare productions, jazz concerts, evenings of poetry and prose. The White House became a showcase for American artistic achievement, a stage where the nation's best performers could display their talents before the most distinguished possible audience. Jackie personally curated much of this programming, selecting artists and designing events that reflected her own sophisticated taste, while also serving the broader goal of elevating American culture. The Concerts for Young People initiative was particularly innovative. Jackie understood that culture needed to be cultivated in the next generation, that exposing young people to great art was an investment in America's future. She arranged for performances specifically designed to introduce children to classical music and other art forms, making the White House an educational venue as well as a showcase for established artists. These weren't just token gestures. They reflected a genuine belief that cultural education mattered, that America's children deserved access to the best that human creativity had produced. The state dinners during the Kennedy administration became legendary for their elegance and sophistication. Jackie redesigned everything from the menus to the table settings to the entertainment, creating events that were more like artistic productions than mere political receptions. She introduced round tables to replace the long, formal tables that had been traditional, encouraging conversation and intimacy among guests. She hired French chef René Verdon to transform the White House kitchen, elevating the food from institutional American to haute cuisine. Every detail was considered, every element designed to create an experience worthy of the most important gatherings in the world. The international dimension of Jackie's cultural work was significant. Her famous visit to Paris in 1961, where she charmed President de Gaulle and the French press, established her as a diplomatic asset. Her fluency in French, her knowledge of French culture, her obvious sophistication, all of this won over a nation that often looked down on American provincialism. Jack famously introduced himself to the Paris press corps as the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, acknowledging that his wife had stolen the show. Similar successes followed in other countries. Jackie's visits to India and Pakistan in 1962 generated enormous goodwill, her grace and curiosity winning admirers across the subcontinent. She toured ancient sites with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions, and presented an image of American culture that contradicted stereotypes of crude, materialistic Yankees. The diplomatic value of these trips was real. Jackie was a one-woman soft power initiative, winning hearts and minds through culture and charm rather than through military might or economic pressure. The relationship between the Kennedys' cultural project and their political goals was not coincidental. The Cold War was, in part, a competition between systems, and that competition extended to culture. The Soviets,